Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you all fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. I grew up in a home where love was not evenly distributed. My childhood was a chaotic mix of premature responsibilities and loaded silences. We were 4 siblings, and my oldest sister, Barbara, was always the one who took on the role of mother when our real mother was away. Life forced us to grow up fast, too fast. When our 4th sibling was born and our mother was confined to the hospital with postpartum complications, that event changed everything. My father worked long hours, and the burden of taking care of the house fell on Barbara and me. I still remember those days, gray and heavy, as if the whole house was shrouded in a veil of sadness and exhaustion. But nothing prepared us for dealing with Hugo, our 3rd brother, who by then was 9 years old. Hugo was different. From the time he started walking, something about him seemed off, as if he lacked that spark you see in other children's eyes. But what at first seemed like apathy soon revealed itself to be something darker. I can't say exactly when it started, but there were signs. Small things at first. Broken toys that couldn't have damaged themselves. Neighborhood animals that mysteriously disappeared. And that strange pleasure Hugo seemed to take when others suffered. Barbara and I tried to keep everything under control, but Hugo was a hurricane of chaos. It was as if he enjoyed challenging us, as if he knew we were too exhausted to face him. One night, shortly after our new brother's arrival, it was raining hard. The sound of the storm filled the house, and Barbara and I were trying to sleep while Hugo, as usual, prowled the halls. Something in the air woke me up, a strange feeling, an instinct I couldn't ignore. I got up and went to look for my sister. I found her in the kitchen, trembling. In the center of the table was a knife, one of the big ones, and Hugo was standing in front of it with a smile that was not of a child. His gaze, empty but at the same time full of something indescribable, was fixed on her. Barbara managed to disarm him, but that night changed something in us. Hugo was not a naughty boy. He was something else, something dangerous. The next few weeks became a battleground. We couldn't tell my father. He was too worried about my mother and the new baby. And even if we wanted to, how could we explain to him what was happening? That our brother, only 9 years old, seemed to have an infinite capacity for cruelty. So we kept quiet and confronted Hugo as best we could, always hoping it was just a phase. But it wasn't. Hugo seemed to feed on our fear. One afternoon, as it was raining again, Barbara and I were watching the baby in the living room. The storm outside was violent, with thunder rattling the windows. Hugo suddenly appeared, his face impassive, holding a jar filled with something cloudy. Before we could react, he threw the contents onto the table. It was acid. He had taken it from my father's tools. The table was ruined, but the worst thing was the message that became clear to us. Hugo had no limits. After that incident, my sister and I started taking turns watching him. One of us always had to be awake while the other slept, but the exhaustion was unbearable. The house, already burdened with sadness from my mother's absence, had become a hostile place, where every corner seemed to conceal a threat. Even the sound of the rain, which used to relax me, became a reminder that danger was near, always lurking. There was a night I will never forget. It was raining harder than ever, and the baby was crying incessantly. Barbara was trying to soothe him while I checked to make sure the windows were closed. That's when I heard a noise in the baby's room. My heart stopped. I rushed in and saw Hugo, standing by the crib, holding a pillow. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I felt real terror, as if I was facing something inhuman. He said nothing, just dropped the pillow and left the room as if nothing had happened. That night I didn't sleep. I sat outside the door of the boys' room with a stick in my hand, trembling with every clap of thunder that resounded outside. I knew I couldn't go on like this, that something had to change, but I didn't know what to do. How do you protect your family from someone who is also your family? How do you admit that a child can be so dangerous? When our mother finally returned home, the situation calmed down a bit. Hugo seemed to control himself in her presence, but Barbara and I knew he hadn't changed. He was just waiting. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me from across the room, with that smile that chilled my blood. Years later, when we finally left that house and moved away from Hugo, the tension in my body began to disappear, but the fear never went away completely. Growing up, Hugo became a ruthless being, of that I am sure. Though he walked away from our family years ago, stories about him always find their way to me. whispered in fearful conversations or news articles that never mention his name directly, but describe acts so cold and calculated that I know they bear his mark. I know he has done unimaginable things, things that even in my worst nightmares I could never have anticipated. Hugo was a storm that never dissipated, a darkness that could not be contained, and though he left us behind, his shadow never entirely disappeared. Sometimes I think that darkness was born with him, a part of his essence from the first breath. It's hard to accept, but life has shown me that sometimes evil is not learned or imposed by the environment. Sometimes evil is simply born with people. And so, every time I hear the sound of the rain beating against the windows, I go back to being that helpless child in the halls of our house. Because although Hugo is no longer physically near, his memory, his legacy of terror remains an indelible part of me. The sound of the rain has always been comforting to me. The constant pattering of the drops against the roof enveloped me, like a wet blanket that, despite everything, made me feel safe. Maybe that's why, when I was a teenager living in that secluded house in the country, storms were my favorite companions. But now, many years later, that same sound awakens something dark in me. I can't help but remember that night, the night everything changed. My family lived on a small piece of land surrounded by hills and thick woods. It was a quiet place, too quiet. We had few neighbors, and among them was the Martinez family, who lived a couple of 100 yards from our house, across a wheat field that always seemed to be dancing in the wind. They were a small family. The father, a sturdy, quiet man named Mauricio, his wife Clara, always kind but with an air of melancholy, and their 2 children, Sofia, 9 years old, and little Diego, who was 4 and had Down syndrome. Diego was a peculiar child, always smiling but with a look that seemed beyond this world. I often saw him playing in the Martinez's backyard while I worked in the orchard. His laughter echoed like an echo in the quiet afternoons, and for a moment the field seemed less lonely. I can't say I knew the Martinezes well, but from the outside they seemed like a normal family. I never imagined that under that facade was hidden something so dark. It all began one stormy night. The sky had turned black, and the rain was falling with such force that even the tallest trees were bowed down by it. I was in my room engrossed in a book when I heard a strange noise through the window. At first I ignored it, thinking it was the wind, but then I realized it was screams, high-pitched, desperate, as if someone was crying for help. I turned off the lamp and walked over to the window. Through the rain curtains, I could see lights on in the Martinez house. Something was not right. Clara's silhouette was moving frantically in the courtyard while Mauricio stood motionless in the doorway. Sofia was nowhere in sight, and what disturbed me most was not seeing Diego. That night, the silence mixed with the storm in a way that made my skin crawl. The next morning, the news spread quickly. Diego had disappeared. According to Clara, he had woken up at midnight and, as he usually did, had left his room looking for something, but this time he did not return. The police arrived on the scene, and hours turned into days. The search was extensive, covering nearby fields and woods, but they found no trace of the child. The whole town was in shock. No one could understand how a little boy had disappeared in the middle of the night without a trace. But as the days passed, murmurs began to fill the air. They said that Mauricio was not as affected as he should be, that his attitude was strangely cold, almost indifferent. Some neighbors remembered seeing bruises on Diego's arms weeks before, but no one had asked questions. Then one afternoon, the police returned to the Martinez house, this time not to look for Diego, but to question Mauricio. Suspicions had focused on him, and what they discovered next took everyone's breath away. The night Diego disappeared, something terrible had happened. According to the investigation, Diego had woken up in the middle of the storm, disoriented and crying. His crying woke Mauricio, who, irritated and furious, went looking for him. Diego's screams were heard throughout the house as his father lost control. It was at that moment that Mauricio hit him. Not once, but several times. And then, when the boy stopped moving, when his little body was no longer breathing, silence filled the house. Mauricio, in his desperation to cover up what he had done, wrapped Diego's body in a blanket and waited. When the storm was at its strongest, he left the house with the boy in his arms and headed into the woods. No one knows exactly how he disposed of the body, but days later, they found a small mound of freshly turned earth under a fallen tree. There was Diego. The news shook the whole town like a bolt of lightning. We all wanted to believe that Clara was just another victim in that tragedy, but the truth was even more disturbing. During the trial, it was revealed that Clara knew what had happened from the beginning. According to reports, she had heard Diego's screams that night and had seen Mauricio carry her son's body wrapped in a blanket into the woods. Yet he did nothing. He did not call the police. He did not try to stop him. She said she had been afraid, that she had wanted to protect Sofia and prevent her husband from harming them as well. But by her silence, she became an accomplice. She was arrested along with Mauricio, and her sentence, though minor, separated her from Sofia, who was left in the care of distant relatives. I remember the last time I saw Clara. It was a gray afternoon, and from my window I saw her being taken away in a patrol car. She did not look back. Her face was serene, almost expressionless, as if she had already accepted her fate. But her eyes reflected a deep emptiness, the kind of emptiness left by impossible decisions and guilt that cannot be buried. Over the years, the Martinez house was abandoned, and nature reclaimed what was once theirs. The walls that once guarded laughter and secrets were covered with moss. The windows were broken, and the branches of the nearby trees extended their shadows over the collapsed roof. Time took care of erasing the visible traces of the tragedy, but it did not manage to silence the murmurs that still echo in the village. For others, that place became a forgotten relic, a distant reminder of what happened. But for me, that house still stands, as alive as the day it all fell apart. I can close my eyes and see Diego running through the backyard, his laughter echoing like a wind-blown echo in my house. I can imagine Clara in the kitchen looking out the window with her melancholy expression, while Sofia played with her brother. But those happy memories are mixed with the shadow of that night. Because no storm, no matter how strong, can erase the echoes of what happened. In the sound of every drop that hits the roof during a storm, I can still hear Diego's cry. That cry that no one wanted to console. And in the same constant pounding, I also hear Clara's deafening silence, the silence of one who knew the truth but did nothing. That silence is worse than any scream, because it is the void where justice and compassion should have been. Sometimes I wonder if that house, with its ruins invaded by nature, keeps those secrets as I do. If among the branches that pierce the broken windows, there still remains the essence of a family that once seemed normal, but was broken from the inside. And I wonder if those who cross near the place feel the same as I do, a shiver that does not come from the cold of the storm, but from something deeper, something that is not seen, but felt. No matter how many years pass, no matter how many storms come, Diego's cry and Clara's silence will live in me, like scars that cannot heal. Because there are wounds that time cannot erase, and there are nights when not even the sound of the rain can silence the memories. Rain has always accompanied me like a silent witness to the darkest moments of my life. Not that I have anything against it per se. In fact, as a child, I used to enjoy running in the downpour with my younger brother, David. But now, every time the drops hit the roof, they take me back to that night, to that storm I've never been able to leave behind. David was only 16 years old when he died, but sometimes I feel that he carried more weight in his short life than many adults I have known. He was a kid with a huge heart, the kind that always seeks to make others laugh, even if they are broken inside. But everything changed when our parents divorced. I was 23 years old and had already left home to work in another city, but David was in the process of discovering who he was, and the divorce hit him like a wave that swept him into a dark place he could never get out of. At first, I tried to be there for him. I would come home on weekends, take him to play soccer, or drive around the neighborhood in my old car. I would try to listen to him, even though many times he would just say he was fine, with that forced smile that broke my soul. But while I went back to my work life every Monday, he was trapped between two parents who could barely stand to look each other in the eye, and a loneliness that grew like a shadow in his room. That's when the vices came. It started with something harmless, or so we thought. A few beers with friends, a couple of cigarettes on the corner. But soon he moved on to harder stuff, substances I didn't even know I could get in our little neighborhood. Every time I saw him, he seemed thinner, more subdued. His room, once a mess full of video games, discarded clothes, and magazines, began to smell strange, like a cocktail of sweat, smoke, and something chemical I couldn't identify. One night, I returned home unannounced. The rain was coming down hard, and I had decided to drive hours just to see him, hoping that my surprise visit would cheer him up a bit. As I entered, the house was silent. My mother was in her room, probably exhausted after her double shift at the hospital. My father no longer lived with us, and his absence was a constant reminder of the fracture that had changed us all. I walked past David's door and heard low music, almost like a murmur behind the wood. I thought about going inside, but I was soaking wet, so I headed to my room first to change. It was an insignificant decision, the kind you make without thinking, but then they become breaking points, moments you wish you could undo. The storm did not let up, and the sound of pounding water mingled with the echo of distant thunder. I lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain, feeling strangely calm. But then something unsettled me. I don't know if it was the silence I suddenly noticed behind David's music, or a gut feeling that came over me out of nowhere. I got up and went to his room. The door was closed. I knocked gently, but there was no response. I tried again, this time harder, but all I got was the distant murmur of music. My heart began to beat faster, and I turned the knob in a hurry. The scene I encountered is something I can never erase from my memory. David was lying on the floor, his pale, lifeless face illuminated by the dim light of his desk lamp. Beside him lay an empty syringe and an open bottle of pills. For an instant, my mind refused to process it. I knelt beside him, shaking him, trying to wake him up, but his body was cold, immobile, as if he no longer belonged to the world we shared. The storm outside seemed to have intensified. Every clap of thunder shook the house, and the rain pounded on the windows with uncontrolled fury, as if the sky itself was crying for what had just happened. I tried to revive him, called 911, screamed until my throat hurt, but I knew, deep down, that it was too late. The paramedics arrived quickly, but their faces said it all without words. My mother came out of her room, and the sound of her heartbreaking cry mixed with the noise of the storm. I don't remember much more of that night, only fragments, as if my mind had decided to erase the most painful details to protect me. For weeks I could not enter his room. It was as if that space had been trapped in time, frozen in that last night. But when I finally did, I found little clues to what had been going through his mind. A notebook with dark drawings and sadness-filled messages, photos of our family before the divorce, and a half-written note that I never quite understood. I am tormented by the thought that perhaps I could have done more, that maybe if I had arrived a few minutes earlier, if I had gone into his room instead of changing first, I could have changed the outcome. But the reality is that David had been fighting something I couldn't see for some time, something that had grown inside him until it had consumed him completely. Now, every time it rains, I feel like I go back to that night. The sound of the drops hitting the roof transports me to the exact moment I found my brother, and the echoing thunder reminds me of my mother's scream. No matter how many years go by, no matter how hard I try to move on, the rain will always take me back to that room, to that storm that never ended. David is gone, but his absence weighs more than his presence ever did. And as long as I live, I will carry the guilt, the unanswered questions, and the memory of a night when the whole world seemed to crumble in the rain. I have never liked the rain, and not because of the cold or the discomfort of getting wet, but because of what it makes me remember. Every drop that hits the ground seems to bring back a piece of the past, a remnant of a time I thought was buried, but that refuses to stay still. I now live in a small apartment in a city where no one knows me. There are no curious neighbors, no questions about my former life, and that's what I need most. But there are nights like this when the rain beats furiously against the windows that memories haunt me, and I can't escape them. Because even though I try to live as if that part of my history didn't exist, I can't ignore that I was part of something terrible, something that left a void in my soul that I will never be able to fill. It all started 10 years ago at a time when my life had no direction. I was freshly laid off, with a broken relationship and a distant family. That's when I met him. I never knew if his real name was Samuel, but that's what we all called him. Samuel was a man with a piercing gaze and a serene voice, the kind of guy who could convince you of anything just by talking to you. His presence was magnetic, and his words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. At first, it all seemed harmless. Samuel was leading a group that met to search for the meaning of life in an isolated cabin in the mountains. I was invited to one of their meetings, and, in my desperation to find something to hold on to, I accepted. There I met the other members, people as lost as I was. There were young people who had run away from their families, single mothers, aimless retirees. We all shared the same need for something more, something to give us meaning. Samuel spoke to us of a way, a spiritual path that would lead us to transcend this world full of suffering. His charisma was undeniable, and his words had a strange power over us. He made us feel special, as if we were the only ones chosen to reach a truth that the rest of the world would never understand. Soon, meetings became extended retreats, and the cabin in the mountains became a permanent retreat. I quit my job and severed the few ties I had left with the outside world. At the time, I didn't see it as a sacrifice, but as a liberation. There, under Samuel's guidance, I believed I found a new family, a community that accepted me for who I was. But things began to change. Samuel became stricter, more controlling. What at first was advice on how to live a fuller life became absolute orders. He told us what to eat, when to sleep, even what we could think. At first, no one questioned him. After all, he was our guide, our savior. But over time, I began to sense that something wasn't right. One night, during one of the rituals we did in the hut, Samuel spoke of the end. He told us that the world was doomed, that a great cataclysm would soon come, and that only we, the chosen ones, could escape that suffering. To do so, we had to prepare ourselves to transcend, to leave our bodies behind and reach a higher plane of existence. At the time, I thought he was talking about a kind of spiritual change, an inner transformation. But later I understood what he really meant. I can't explain what it was that made me open my eyes. Perhaps it was the tone in Samuel's voice, more somber than usual, or the way some members began to look at me, as if they knew something I did not. The truth is that shortly after that night I decided to leave. It was not easy. When I told Samuel that I wanted to leave, his expression changed completely. His words, once warm and welcoming, became cold and threatening. But somehow I made it out. I returned to the city with little more than the clothes on my back. The first few months were difficult. I felt that I had lost my way again, that life had no meaning outside of that group. But as time went on, I began to rebuild myself little by little, until that episode remained a bad dream. Everything changed one rainy night, similar to this one. I was watching the news when the headline came on, "Mass suicide at a cabin in the mountains." I felt a shiver run through my entire body. The news report showed images of the cabin now surrounded by police cars and ambulances. Dozens of bodies were found inside, all dressed in the same white robes we used to wear for rituals. They had drunk a poison prepared by Samuel, who was also found among them. They had followed their plan to the end. I stood transfixed in front of the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. I thought of the faces of the group members, of their laughter, of the conversations we had by the fire. People I had once called my family now lay dead, victims of a man we had trusted with our lives. And I, almost, could have been one of them. Since then, the rain is not the same for me. When I hear it, I can't help but imagine that night in the cabin. The sound of the water hitting the roof as they, one by one, drank the poison Samuel offered them. I wonder what they felt in those last moments. Was there fear, doubt, or did they simply accept their fate, convinced they were doing the right thing? There are nights when I dream about the cabin. In my dreams, I'm there, surrounded by them, but I can't speak or move. I watch them drink the poison, their bodies collapsing one after another, while Samuel stares at me as if he knows I'm there, watching. And then I wake up with the sound of the rain echoing in my ears and the memory of what was and what could have been. I know I can never escape this. It is part of me, an invisible scar that I carry every day, as deep as the chasm that group left in my soul. No matter how much time passes or how many times I tried to convince myself that I made the right decision in leaving, there is always something, a lingering shadow, that reminds me that I was there, that I was part of something so dark that words can barely encompass it. I wonder if I will ever be able to forgive myself. How does one live with the knowledge that you shared space, ideas, and hopes with a man like Samuel? I tell myself that I am not like him, that I was not complicit in his final acts. But in the darkest moments, when the rain hits the windows hard and forces me to relive those days, I can't help but think that, in a way, I was. I fed his power with my blind faith. I followed his words without question, and with each step I took toward the cabin, I moved closer to his madness. Silence is my refuge, but also my condemnation. Sometimes I wonder if this silence is not the same silence that settled in the cabin that night, just after the last of them drank the poison. A thick, almost palpable silence laden with unanswered questions and a pain so vast that not even the living can comprehend it. It is in this silence that I meet the ghosts of my past, those I cannot leave behind. I want to believe that they, in their last moments, found peace. But deep down, I know that peace does not exist for those of us left behind. Their deaths are a weight that I carry with me, an invisible chain that I cannot break. And even if I try to move on, to build a life away from that place, there will always be something that binds me to that cabin, to that community, to that night. Because there are things that cannot be undone, stories that cannot be erased, scars that never heal. And as long as the rain continues to fall, bringing with it the whispers of the past, I will continue to face them, the ghosts that I myself helped to create. I don't know if I'll ever find redemption, but until then I'll keep walking under this gray sky, carrying the echo of the rain and the weight of a memory that will never leave me in peace. I have always thought that there are truths that should remain buried, like bones forgotten in the depths of the earth. But life, with its cruel sense of humor, takes care of digging them up when you least expect it. Mine came on a gray afternoon, under a storm that seemed to want to tear the roofs off the houses and erase everything it touched. I was 17 years old and lived in a small town where the rain was as constant as the rumors. I never imagined that that rain would mark the beginning of my descent into an abyss from which I have still not been able to escape. My childhood was, at least in appearance, normal. I lived with my mother, a reserved woman who worked long hours in a local store, and my uncle, Ernesto, a quiet and enigmatic man who had always been close to us like a permanent shadow. I never knew my father. Whenever I asked about him, my mother would dodge the subject, saying that it was better that way, that some people just weren't cut out to be fathers. I accepted her answers, though deep down I always felt an emptiness. That day the storm began early. Dark clouds piled up in the sky as if they were planning something terrible, and the wind blew with unusual force. I remember staying at home, watching out the window as the rain lashed the town. That's when I found the box. It was hidden in the attic, a dusty space I rarely visited. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just trying to kill time while the sky was roaring outside. The box was old weathered wood and had the initials EM engraved on it. I shouldn't have cared, but something about it caught my eye. I opened it carefully, as if I knew I was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. Inside, I found photographs, letters, and documents that seemed to belong to my mother and Ernesto. There were images of them in their youth, smiling together, with a closeness that seemed strange to me even then. But what really chilled my blood was a handwritten letter, signed by my mother. The words were confusing at first, as if my mind resisted understanding what I was reading. But the more I read, the clearer the truth became. Ernesto was not my uncle, he was my father, and my mother was not only my mother, she was also his sister. The air seemed to disappear from my lungs. The whole world I had built up in my mind, all the certainties I took for granted, crumbled in an instant. I sat on the floor of the loft, the letter trembling in my hands while the rain pounded furiously on the roof. I couldn't understand, I didn't want to understand. How was it possible that my life was built on such a grotesque lie? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words of the letter floating in my mind, mingling with images of my mother and Ernesto. I began to remember things that had gone unnoticed before, the furtive glances between them, the awkward silences when someone mentioned my father, the way Ernesto was always close but never too close. It all fit together, and at the same time nothing made sense. In the days that followed, I tried to act normal, but the weight of what I knew was unbearable. I found Ernesto's presence in the house suffocating, as if every time I saw him I could feel the weight of his secret. My mother, for her part, seemed oblivious to my torment, or perhaps too busy to notice. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to understand why. I began to investigate, looking for more answers among the old things in the attic and in any corner of the house where I could find something. What I discovered only deepened my horror. There were more letters, some written by my mother and others by Ernesto, in which they spoke of their relationship, of how they had grown up together in an atmosphere of isolation and family secrets. They spoke of love, but also of guilt and fear, of how they had decided to keep me as their biggest secret. I could not bear it. The idea that my existence was the result of something so twisted filled me with disgust and rage. I began to feel that my own identity was tainted, that something inside me was inherently wrong. I began to isolate myself, to avoid my friends, and to spend hours locked in my room, listening to the sound of the rain that never seemed to stop. My relationship with my mother deteriorated rapidly. Although I never told her what I knew, my attitude toward her changed. Every time I saw her, I felt a mixture of love and repulsion that I could not explain. With Ernesto, it was even worse. I could no longer look at him without feeling an anger burning inside me. One night, the tension reached its peak. The storm was particularly intense, with lightning lighting up the sky and thunder rattling the windows. I was in my room looking at the letter once again, when I felt something inside me snap. I left my room and went to the attic, searching for more answers, as if finding an additional detail might ease the weight of what I knew. There, among the shadows and the constant sound of rain, I found something else, a diary. It was my mother's, and the pages were full of confessions that should never have come to light. She talked about her relationship with Ernesto, how she had tried to stay away from him but always ended up coming back, how she had decided to keep me even though she knew what that meant. As I read, I felt a mixture of emotions that I could not control: sadness, anger, betrayal. But worst of all was fear. Fear of what this meant for me, of what it might mean for my future. I closed the diary and went downstairs, leaving the loft behind me. That night, as the storm raged outside, I knew my life would never be the same. The truth had changed me in a way I could not reverse. And though I have tried to move on, to build a life away from that town, the rain always takes me back. In every drop, in every thunderclap, I hear the echo of that revelation, of that secret that marked me forever. I don't know if I will ever be able to forgive my mother or Ernesto, or even myself for existing under these circumstances. All I know is that the storm never truly ceases, and that, as long as I live, I will carry the weight of a truth I never asked to discover. I always knew something wasn't right in the relationship between my Uncle Ramon and his wife Patricia. There was something in the way she avoided his gaze, in how she would tilt her head slightly when he spoke, as if calculating her every move so as not to provoke him. Ramon lived with Patricia just 3 houses down from mine, and although we were never particularly close, he was always present in my life, like a distant but familiar figure. Until one day he disappeared. It was a stormy night when it all started. I remember being in my room listening to the rain pounding hard against the windows. The wind was moving with an intensity that seemed to want to uproot the trees, and the thunder rumbled like divine warnings. It was then that I heard my mother comment that something strange was happening at Ramon's house. "I haven't seen him in days," she said with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. Ramon's disappearance became the central topic in the neighborhood for weeks. Some thought he had simply abandoned Patricia, that he had run away from his monotonous life in search of something better. Others whispered darker rumors, theories debated in whispers among the neighbors. But no one seemed to have concrete answers, and Patricia, despite the growing attention, maintained an eerie calm. He said that Ramon had gone out one night after an argument and never returned. He claimed to know nothing more, and his imperturbable face made his words sound convincing. However, there was something about his attitude that made me uneasy. Every time I passed by his house, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just Ramon's absence that made that house feel different. It was something deeper, something I couldn't identify. As the days passed, the silence surrounding the case began to become unbearable. It seemed that the whole neighborhood had resigned itself to the idea that Ramon had simply disappeared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to the story than Patricia was saying. It was weeks later, on another stormy night, when the pieces began to fall into place. I was alone at home, watching out the window as the rain turned the streets into rivers. The streetlight flickered. throwing intermittent flashes that made shadows dance on the walls of neighboring houses. It was then that I saw Patricia. She was in her backyard, in the pouring rain, moving swiftly. Despite the darkness and the curtain of water, I could make out that he was carrying something in his hands, something wrapped in a tarpaulin. Her movement was frantic, almost desperate, and what I saw next made my heart stop. Patricia was digging. I couldn't look away, even though my instinct was screaming at me to do so. Every shovelful of dirt he threw into the air seemed to synchronize with the thunder roaring in the sky. Finally, he placed what he was carrying in the hole, covered everything quickly, and returned home as if nothing had happened. That image stuck in my mind, and my curiosity, mixed with a growing fear, led me to investigate further. The next day, my heart pounding in my ears, I approached Patricia's yard while she was at the market. What I found chilled me to the bone. The earth where I had dug was messy, but not enough to hide traces of anything else. There were bones, small fragments barely sticking out of the damp earth. My mind was filled with terrifying images. Were they Ramon's remains? Was it possible that Patricia had killed him and buried him there? The idea seemed as absurd as it was terrifying, but the bones were there, evidence I could not ignore. I returned home with trembling hands, unable to process what I had seen. For days I avoided crossing paths with Patricia. Every time I saw her from afar, my stomach churned. Her calm smile and the way she greeted the neighborhood were now unbearable, but the whole truth soon came out. The police, alerted by a neighbor who had also noticed Patricia's suspicious movements, arrived at her home a week later. What they discovered was much worse than they had imagined. Ramon had not only been murdered, Patricia had dismembered his body, cooked part of it, and ingested it. The remains that she could not consume she had buried in different parts of the yard and thrown in the garbage in small quantities. The motive behind her act was revealed during the interrogation. Ramon had abused her for years, subjecting her to an endless cycle of physical and psychological violence. Patricia, cornered by years of abuse and despair, had decided to take control the only way she knew how. Details of the case filtered out little by little, each one more disturbing than the last. Neighbors began to recall muffled screams that were often heard in Ramon's house, arguments that ended abruptly. Everything fit, but the horror was unbearable. The neighborhood was plunged into horror. The quiet street where I grew up was never the same. Ramon and Patricia's house was closed down, and rumors turned into stories told in whispers. No one dared to look at the abandoned house with its broken windows and untidy garden, as if the structure itself feared to remember what had happened within those walls. The trees that once seemed protective and shady now looked like mute witnesses to a tragedy, their fallen leaves as if weeping for the life that had been lost there. The neighborhood fractured. We were no longer a community, but a collection of people who avoided looking each other in the eye. Mistrust infiltrated conversations. Greetings that were once polite, but now sounded empty, as if we were all aware of what had happened, but none of us wanted to admit it out loud. Every time someone mentioned Patricia's or Ramon's name, the air became heavy, as if an invisible ghost was creeping in among us, reminding us of what had happened on those dark, rainy nights. Sometimes during the nights when the wind and rain beat furiously, I can't help but remember that image. Patricia in the rain, digging desperately, her figure moving with a frenzy that still seems to pulsate in my mind. Her face was a mask of desperation, but also of something else, something much darker. Lightning illuminated his skeletal figure as he covered what he had buried with a swiftness that only guilt could have driven. Each shovelful of earth, each action, seemed a last attempt to erase the irremediable, as if the rain could wash away his sins, as if all the horror could disappear with the soil it covered. And though I try not to think about it, there is one question that haunts me. How much longer would it have taken for someone else to disappear if she hadn't been stopped? Every time I pass by that empty house, every time I hear the pattering of the rain, I wonder if there are more secrets buried, more lives forgotten under the layer of earth Patricia had sown in her desperation. How many people have been about to become her next victims without even knowing it? Sometimes I find myself watching strangers with a distrust I can't control, imagining their stories, looking for signs of what they might be hiding. The noise seems to whisper its truth to me. Secrets never stay buried forever. The rain, Even if it extinguishes the traces of the past, always leaves something behind, something that cannot be erased. Maybe it's memories, maybe it's sensations, or maybe it's the awareness that all of us at some point are doomed to face the echoes of what we have done. The wind that whispers through the branches of the trees carries with it those echoes, those unrevealed secrets. And I wonder how many stories like Ramon and Patricia's have been buried under the weight of a storm, waiting for their moment to come to light. Sometimes fate has a strange way of playing with us, and when you try to move on, you realize that the past never leaves you alone. It all started with a breakup. Nothing dramatic, nothing out of the ordinary. It was one of those separations that many of us would consider normal in the course of a relationship. The typical relationship that was wearing out, where love was no longer enough, and where silences became longer than words. This was my relationship with Irene. We met a few years ago, and at first everything was perfect. Like any young couple, we believed that everything we did together had meaning. I remember the evenings when we would talk until dawn, the laughter shared over simple dinners, and those moments when each other's company was all we needed to feel complete. But as time went by, something changed, something that I could not immediately identify, but which, in the end, turned out to be the beginning of the end. Arguments became more frequent, misunderstandings more constant, and love became a burden. We no longer shared the same aspirations or the same dreams. We looked into each other's eyes, and there was a distance we could not ignore. We loved each other, yes, but in a way that no longer had the strength and vitality of before. The affection became routine, the hugs were cold, the words empty. After months of unsuccessful attempts to save what was left, we decided to break up. It was not an act of resentment, but rather a mutual acceptance that we were no longer happy. The separation was clean, calm, or so I thought at the time. No one yelled, no one broke anything. We simply accepted that our paths no longer crossed in the same way. Irene moved into an apartment near mine, and although the distance between us was small, I felt that this separation was the space needed to heal, to start over. But things did not end that way. At first, the first few days were difficult, but I was fine. Trying to get on with my life, keeping busy, hanging out with friends, doing things that would distract me from the loneliness that was beginning to consume my space. I thought that time would help heal the wounds, that eventually I could regain peace. But Irene kept sending me messages. At first, I thought it was a way to find closure, something that would give us a chance to understand what had gone wrong. But soon the messages began to be different. They were no longer about the relationship, nor about what we had been through. They became constant, desperate, even harassing. I miss you. I need to see you. Please don't leave me alone. At first, I tried to be sympathetic, to think that maybe the separation had affected him more than I thought. But soon those words turned into something darker, something I could no longer ignore. I knew something wasn't right. She started sending me messages in the middle of the night, messages that woke me up, messages full of despair and anguish. Sometimes she would simply say, "I can't live without you. I need you." And other times the words were harsher, more direct. "You'll regret leaving me. I'm not going to let you go so easily. You'll see what I can do." Fear settled in my chest. Even though I didn't want to admit it, I knew something was wrong, but the denial was strong. My heart told me that it was still possible to fix things, but my mind insisted otherwise. I knew that I had to cut off all contact, that I had to be firm, but I did it cautiously. What else could I do? I no longer loved her. I just wanted her to disappear from my life, that I could move on without having to look back. But Irene didn't seem to understand. Her messages continued, even when I stopped responding. Her harassment became more present, more unbearable. Every time I looked at my phone, there was a new notification from her, and each time, it was more alarming than the last. It was then that I met Valeria. I met her by chance, in a coffee shop one rainy day. She sheltered me from the storm with a warm smile and a casual conversation that, in its simplicity, gave me a break. Valeria was not like the other women I had met. She was different. There was something about her that captivated me from the first moment. Her laughter was like music, full of energy, and the way her eyes sparkled in the dim light made me feel there was something special about her. We talked for hours, no rush, no pressure. Within a few days, we began to see each other more often. Her messages were light, full of curiosity to get to know me. Everything seemed so natural with her. Valeria made me feel like I could breathe, that maybe I could start over. With Valeria, everything was different. Her tenderness, her laughter, the way she listened to me. Everything seemed to fit in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. Her presence calmed me, made me forget the constant torment of Irene's messages. And although my thoughts were still a jumble of confused emotions, I began to think that maybe life was giving me a second chance, that maybe I could be happy again. Valeria made me think that the sun could come out after the storm, that after the darkness there was always light. But the past, as is often the case, was not willing to let me go so easily. It was a Sunday afternoon, a rainy afternoon. The wind was beating furiously on the windows of my apartment, and the sound of the water falling incessantly made everything seem more unreal, more tense. Valeria and I were at home, sharing a quiet afternoon together. We were laughing, talking, enjoying the calm that had settled between us. We had prepared something to eat and were planning to watch a movie. Everything seemed in place, everything seemed fine, but something in the air was changing. A feeling, a shiver ran down my spine for no apparent reason. I heard a strange noise, as if someone was banging on the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the sound repeated itself. A sharp, loud knock. It wasn't normal, it wasn't something the wind could do. I got up to check, but before I could get near the door, the sound stopped. I was silent for a few seconds, waiting, but I didn't hear anything again. I stood there, motionless, not knowing what to do. My heart was beating faster. Something was not right. The door burst open with a loud creak. I turned, my body reacting instinctively, but before I could approach the door or close the entrance, I saw her, Irene. Her face was pale, her eyes reddened from crying and anger, and in her hands, a gun. I didn't understand what was happening. I couldn't process what was happening. My mind could not assimilate the horror of that image. Why? How? Why had he come back? And why in such a dangerous way? I was paralyzed with terror. Valeria, seeing the scene, took a step back, and I tried to get between her and Irene's frenzy. But it was useless. It all happened so fast. Gunshots echoed in the room, the sound was deafening, and the force of each impact pushed me backwards. A sharp pain shot through my chest and head. Valeria screamed, and I could see in her eyes a mixture of surprise, fear, and despair. I tried to move to protect her, but it was too late. In the blink of an eye, everything went dark. I woke up in a hospital. The cold light of the room blinded me for a moment. I was lying on a bed, surrounded by beeping machines, flickering lights, and a dazed feeling that kept me suspended between sleep and reality. My body ached. My head wouldn't stop spinning. It took me a couple of minutes to realize what had happened. But when I did, horror gripped me. Valeria was gone. She had died. The police informed me that she had arrived in critical condition, but that she had not survived. Anguish choked me. It was hard to breathe. The image of Irene with the gun in her hands replayed over and over in my mind. She had come to my house, had burst into my life once again, and without thinking, snatched from me everything that was beginning to mean something. It didn't take the police long to find her. She turned herself in without resisting, as if she had been waiting to be caught. She said she had done it because she couldn't bear the thought of losing me, that she didn't understand why I had chosen Valeria instead of her. She told me she thought that, if I saw her, if I faced her love, everything could be like before. But love is not a right. It is not something to be possessed by force. Love is freedom. It is respect, and Irene never understood that. Her love had turned into obsession, and that obsession drove her into darkness. The following weeks were an ordeal. The memories of that afternoon, of that door that opened without warning, of the gunshots, of the pain, haunted me, and the rain, which had always been my comfort, became my enemy. Every time it fell, it reminded me of what I had lost, what I had failed. The rainstorms always seemed to follow me, as if nature itself wanted me not to forget what had happened. Sometimes on those rainy nights, when the sound of the storm hits the windows and the shadows seem to lengthen more than usual, I close my eyes and ask myself, how could I have been so blind? Why didn't I see what Irene was becoming? Why wasn't I able to protect Valeria? And above all, why does the rain never seem to stop in my memory? The answers never came. and maybe they never will. In the end, all I was left with was the rain, constant and heavy, pounding on the windows of my soul, reminding me that time does not erase the scars we leave on others or the scars we let ourselves make. Life goes on, but something in me was broken that day, and although I try to move on, I know that Irene's shadow will always haunt me, in every storm, in every early morning when I close my eyes. My grandfather never talked much about his past. He was the kind of man who kept his memories locked away as if he feared that simply mentioning them might make them more real. You could say that silence was his refuge, his only way to protect himself from the ghosts that haunted him. But as if the rain had the ability to make those memories break free, he would begin to speak on the rainiest of nights. The rumbling of the wind against the windows and the sound of the storm seemed to act as a master key, unlocking the doors to a past he had kept hidden for so long. It was never straightforward. No, his stories were not like those of other grandparents, full of anecdotes and wisdom. No. He spoke as one who whispers in fear, as if each word was difficult to say, and at the same time he would need to let it out to free himself from an unbearable burden. I often found myself sitting close to him, not daring to interrupt, absorbing every word, every broken fragment of his story. I didn't dare ask for details. I knew that if I did, I would probably miss that rare opportunity to hear what he was willing to share, even if it was only a small part. It was at those times, when storms were raging against our house, that he would begin to recount his youth. In those dark days when war was raging in Europe and the world was on the brink of collapse, my grandfather was at the place where humanity lost its dignity, and with it, its very humanity. It was then that his story of terror and survival began to take shape in my ears. I remember as if it were yesterday the first time I heard him speak of his captivity. I was about 12 years old and would often take shelter in my room during thunderstorms, under the covers, feeling that the roar of the wind somehow enveloped me, as if the whole world might crumble. It was one of those nights of torrential rain when, in a low, almost inaudible tone, he began to tell me about the day he was captured. I knew something serious had happened in his youth, but I never imagined what that past entailed. A past shrouded in darkness, something he never talked about unless the wind, as in those days, was willing to push him to shed his silence. My grandfather, born in a small village where life was peaceful, never imagined that the war could reach him. He was only 18 years old when he was captured. At that time, he thought that war was something distant, that it would never knock on his door, that it would not affect him. But fate, like the wind that carries the rain, does not ask permission. On the gray morning of his imprisonment, the air was charged with something indescribable. The train that took him to the concentration camp was crowded with people with cramped bodies, with broken souls. No one knew what awaited them, but everyone knew that something horrible was about to happen. Screams filled the wagon, but they were not just screams of fear, they were screams of despair. My grandfather told me that on that train, death already felt close, like a silent shadow creeping among the passengers. In that carriage, no one dared to look into each other's eyes, as if by doing so they could see the horrors that were coming. The journey seemed endless. The days dragged on, and the cold penetrated the bones of all the prisoners. There was something in the air, something that choked hope, a weight that could be touched, that weighed more than the bodies themselves. The people began to lose track of time. The days became the same endless nightmare, and when they reached their destination, they no longer had the capacity to fight, to resist. They were taken off the train and taken to a camp, which my grandfather never wanted to refer to by name. Although he had learned to forget it, the echo of his name continued to resonate in his memories like a cursed bell. It was a place where shadows loomed over tired bodies, a place where humanity was stripped of its form, became something dirtier, more primitive, a place where it didn't matter who you were, only if you could keep breathing. He told me that, at first, the prisoners did not understand what was happening. It seemed like a dream from which they would never wake up, until the conditions began to make it clear that nothing was a dream, that death or life depended only on resistance. Hunger, cold, and constant vigilance were the daily bread. Food was scarce, and rations were nothing more than a mockery. The bread they were given was impregnated with dust and dirt. a repulsive mixture that only served to temporarily dull the feeling of emptiness in the stomach. My grandfather told me that, at one point, he began to wonder if he had somehow begun to die from the first day he walked through that door. The fear was not only manifested in the body, in the skin that tore from the cold or hunger. No, the real fear was to see how the people, the prisoners, began to lose themselves. The looks became empty, hollow, as if each one was stripping himself of his humanity, as if survival no longer had any meaning, as if the instinct to preserve life was stronger than the reason to live with dignity. My grandfather used to tell me that that was what terrified him the most, how the people who were once his friends began to fight each other for a simple crumb of bread, how, in order to stay alive, they became shadows, and worst of all, knowing that he himself was beginning to lose something inside himself, as if despair could infect him in the same way as hunger. The night, when the wind crept through the cracks in the field, seemed to bring with it more than cold. It was as if the souls of the dead were roaming, restlessly, looking for a way out. However, the real fear, the one that truly dehumanizes, was in the constant vigilance. The guards didn't just watch, they didn't just observe. They were like shadows lurking from the towers with eyes that not only assessed the physical, but saw beyond, touching the deepest, crushing any attempt at hope. The worst moment of all, my grandfather told me, was when a group of prisoners tried to escape. No one had dared to do so before because death was certain. But in that storm of fury and despair, some believed that perhaps there was something beyond the walls, something worthwhile. My grandfather saw them being caught before they could advance, dragged back to the camp, and before everyone's eyes, executed. The sound of the gunshots, of the souls being ripped out, was etched in his memory. And at that moment, something in him broke, because he understood that escape was not only an act of the brave, but of the damned. Thus, day after day, my grandfather survived. Not out of bravery, but out of sheer necessity. There were promises he could not break. Promises made to his mother before he was taken to that hell. Promises that, though torn by pain and despair, still lay dormant in his chest. When the war ended and he was released, he was no longer the same. The scars were not only on his skin, but in his soul. And those scars, invisible to others, were the ones that continued to haunt him. He always told me that storms were not just meteorological. Some storms, the darkest ones, happen inside us, the ones that never dissipate. I had never believed in signs, or at least not until that night. The rains in my city were always intense, almost furious, but that night there was something different in the air. The wind whipped at the windows with unusual force, as if it wanted to sweep away everything in its path. The sound of water hitting the roof, mixed with thunder, creating an oppressive atmosphere. The empty streets, almost forgotten by the city, overflowed in rivers of murky water, and the streetlights flickered as if they were about to go out. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind people describe as peaceful, where each house seemed to be an extension of the other. People knew each other, exchanged smiles and greetings when they passed each other on the street. No one thought that something dark might be lurking in such an idyllic setting. No one except me. I was an ordinary man, one neighbor among many. I never thought of myself as special. My routine was simple: work, some exercise, solitary dinners, and then the quiet of my home. But ever since I moved to that street, there was something that didn't leave me alone. Something that, no matter how hard I tried to ignore, kept coming back to my mind. The next-door neighbor, Richard. To be honest, I can't say he was a bad person. On the contrary, he seemed like the perfect example of a kind, friendly, and generous man. In fact, the first few times I met him, I found him to be an interesting person. He was older than me, maybe in his 20s, but he always had a smile on his face and a tone of voice so soft that he seemed to put anyone at ease. At first, I didn't think much of it. Richard was just a nice man, like any other neighbor. But something about his behavior began to puzzle me. I always saw him outside his house almost every day, walking in the garden or chatting with other neighbors, but he never seemed to have any close relationship with anyone. He kept to himself, as if he were a person who was just blending in out of politeness, but not really part of the community. He didn't talk much about his personal life, and although he was cordial, he showed no interest in engaging in deeper conversations. He simply kept to his own bubble. But what really made me suspicious was a rainy night like this. That night, the storm had reached its peak. The wind was howling and the streets were flooding fast. My watch read 11:30 when I heard a strange noise coming from Richard's house. At first I thought it was the sound of the rains hitting the roof or perhaps some object falling due to the wind. But as I looked out my living room window, I could see something that chilled my blood. In the midst of the pouring rain, a dark figure was moving in Richard's garden. It wasn't him, not like that. The figure that moved swiftly, almost with eerie agility, didn't look human. My pulse quickened, and without thinking, I grabbed my keys and stepped out onto the porch to get a better look. The street lights were flickering as if they were going out, plunging everything into almost total darkness. I watched as the figure, with terrifying precision, disappeared behind the house. My instinct urged me to move closer, and although my body wanted to retreat, I found myself walking toward the back door of Richard's house, my heart pounding. I knew what I was doing was unwise, but curiosity got the better of me. As I approached, I caught a glimpse of something that brought me to an abrupt halt. The back door of the house was slightly ajar, and a dim light was shining inside. I heard muffled noises, as if someone was moving something heavy. I was about to take another step when a familiar noise chilled my blood, the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Only the rain and the wind were pounding the walls of the house. For an instant, I thought I was imagining things, that the storm was playing tricks on me. But then the light in Richard's house flickered, and I could see a tall, slender figure moving slowly toward the back door. My heart was pounding. It was him, Richard. But something in his bearing, in his walk, made me hesitate. His movements were too smooth, too controlled. He wasn't the friendly neighbor I used to exchange greetings with. Something didn't fit. I stood there, transfixed, watching Richard stop in front of the door and disappear into the house. What happened next was what really changed everything. Soon after, a figure came out of the house. This time, it was not Richard, but someone else. At first I couldn't see his face, but the silhouette was moving quickly, as if he was running away. My mind, on the verge of panic, began to process what I had witnessed. I couldn't help but think that something dark was going on in that house, something far beyond anything I could imagine. I decided to leave. My legs were shaking and my hands were sweaty. I didn't understand what I had just seen, but I felt I had to investigate. I quickly returned home, but that night I couldn't sleep. Images of what I saw kept replaying in my head, and the sound of the rain seemed to amplify every thought. The next day, calm had returned to the city, but something had changed in me. Every time I looked at Richard's house, I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the air had become thicker. For days I watched from my window, hoping to see something that would confirm my suspicions, something that might give me answers. But everything remained silent. Until one evening, when the streetlights began to flicker again, I saw something that made me shudder. Richard was coming out of his house, but this time he was carrying something in his hands. It was a big bag, one big enough to hide something inside. My stomach churned, and I instantly grabbed my cell phone, intending to call the police. But before I could do anything, the light went out. The phone fell from my hands. What happened next was even stranger. As the night progressed, the rain became heavier and the shadows on the street seemed to lengthen. When I looked out the window, I saw Richard. This time, he was not alone. Beside him walked a figure of slender build whom I had never seen before. They seemed to be conversing, but instantly the figure disappeared around the corner of the street. Richard stood there motionless for several minutes before returning home. That was the last time I saw Richard. Days later, the neighborhood was abuzz with rumors. Apparently someone had disappeared. No one knew who, but the police had begun to investigate. Today, several years later, I still think about what I saw. No one has ever talked about Richard again. No one has been able to figure out what happened in that house. I, for one, could never forget that night. There were no ghosts, no monsters. There was only a man, a kind neighbor, hiding behind a facade that, in the end, was his grave. The rain sometimes seems to wash away those memories, but what I saw, what I heard, is so etched in my mind that I always wonder if someday someone will dare to discover the truth behind his facade. On rainy nights, I always hear something in the distance, something that makes me look out the window again. And although I have never confirmed it, I always feel that in some dark corner, Richard is still watching. My childhood was never what could be considered normal. From a young age, all I knew was the constant back and forth of new homes, new faces, new rules. Life in foster homes was always the same, a series of friendly faces that didn't last long. At first, the memories were blurry, like fragments of a movie that I couldn't quite make out. What I do remember clearly is the feeling of abandonment, as if I never fit into those places. The last house I was in before I became an adult was the worst of all. It was an old wooden house on the outskirts of town, a place that in retrospect had been built with a welcoming smile, but offered only shadows and cold. I remember when I arrived, the rain was torrential. The sky was completely covered with dark clouds, and the wind howled through the trees as if the world was about to collapse. The house seemed so lonely, so secluded from everything, that even the sound of the storm seemed to be drowned in its walls. At first, I thought it might be different, that maybe this family would be different. The woman who welcomed me, her name was Susanna, was kind, warm even. She always offered me a cup of tea, or asked me to sit by the fireplace. The man, Luis, didn't say much. He just stood there in the corner of the living room as if his presence was unimportant, as if he were disconnected from everything. The funny thing was that I never saw Susanna and Luis together for very long. Often Susanna would retire to her room, and Luis would spend hours in the shed behind the house fixing something I never knew what it was. From the beginning, something wasn't right. I can't explain it, but the atmosphere in the house was dense. The feeling that something wasn't right haunted me at all times. The lights in the house flickered strangely and the doors were always locked. When I tried to ask why, Susanna told me it was to maintain security. But I wasn't convinced. People in town never mentioned anything about them, as if no one really knew them. No one would go near them. The house was completely isolated, and although the other houses were not too far away, no one seemed interested in going beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. The first few weeks were quiet, but soon I began to notice strange things. The whispering, the shadows moving around the house when no one was around. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then things started happening that I couldn't ignore. One night, as I was walking down the hallway to go to the bathroom, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I looked back, but no one was there. The house was empty. Everyone was asleep. However, the feeling that someone was watching made me feel vulnerable. When I returned to my room, something on my bed moved, as if someone had laid down there. But it wasn't possible. I was alone in my room. Fear began to nestle in my chest, but I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe my mind was playing on my fears, a consequence of having lived in so many places and in so many strange situations. But things got worse. There was one night, a particularly rainy night, when everything changed. I woke up startled, as if I had heard something. It was the rain, but something else. A metallic sound, as if something was being dragged along the ground. I got out of bed, still half asleep, and headed for the living room. When I reached the end of the hallway, I saw something that paralyzed me. Susanna was standing in front of one of the closed doors, listening quietly, as if waiting for something. There was no light in the house, only the faint light of the storm filtering through the dirty windows. Suddenly she turned to me, with a blank expression on her face, as if she had never seen me before. The look she gave me was that of someone who had forgotten what human was. She said nothing, just stared at me, her eyes dark and empty, as if she was waiting for me to speak. But I could not. The door behind her opened slowly, and a low, unintelligible whisper emerged from the darkness on the other side. Susanna didn't move, didn't even blink. It was then that I understood that she knew something I didn't want to understand. The door slammed shut, and when I turned to run, the house seemed to have fallen into a deep silence. The storm outside suddenly ceased, and all that was left was the feeling of cold that pierced my bones. The next day, everything seemed fine. Susanna acted as if nothing had happened, and Luis was quieter than usual. I didn't ask anything because I didn't want to know, but deep down, anxiety was eating me up. I began to take a closer look at every corner of the house. I noticed that Luis's shed had been locked with a heavy lock, something that was missing before. I felt that something was being hidden, something important, something I was not supposed to see. One afternoon, after several weeks of remaining silent, I received a call. It was an unknown number, but something told me it was important. I answered. The voice on the other end was firm, and although I didn't recognize it at first, I soon realized I was talking to the police. They had found a young girl, also adopted by Susanna and Luis, who had managed to escape from her confinement. In desperation, she had managed to contact the police after being kept locked in the attic of the house. She had mentioned me, although she did not know who I was, and had recounted how she had seen me on several occasions, how my footsteps had crossed hers over the days, but always from a distance, from her captivity. The young woman had managed to escape during one of Susanna's absences when she and Luis had gone to town. The police, upon receiving her call, wasted no time. An operation was deployed, and the rescue was successful. They found the girl, dirty, weak, but alive, and with her, irrefutable evidence of what had happened in the house. Susanna and Luis were arrested. Police reports indicated that the young woman had been under their control for months, without access to the outside world, isolated and abused. She was not alone in her suffering. For years, the disappearances of young people in the area had been attributed to mysterious circumstances, but the truth had been far more macabre. Susanna and Luis had not only adopted children under the facade of a loving family, but had held them captive, hiding them from the eyes of society. The police discovered more grisly details about their secret life. In the shed behind the house, they found the remains of personal belongings belonging to other people, who had apparently been victims of the same fate. The worst of all was to learn that the young woman who had managed to escape was named Laura, and that she had been in that house since she was very young, long before me. She had been one of the first victims, although she had somehow managed to survive, but all that she had suffered she would never get over. Her eyes, when she finally met me, were empty, as if a part of her had died forever in that house. Susanna and Luis were accused of kidnapping, mistreatment, and homicide. The police were never able to determine how many people had fallen into their hands, but enough evidence was found to convict them. The trial was swift, and although their conviction could not bring back what we had lost, at least it served to close a dark chapter in my life. In the end, Laura stayed in a rehab facility. I tried to stay away, although the guilt never left me alone. How could I have missed it? How could I have ignored so many signs? The weight of responsibility consumed me for a long time. Years later, the rain is still falling in the village, and I, although I no longer live there, know that the echoes of that storm will still be inside me. Because when the shadows of memory intertwine with reality, the doors of the houses, though closed, never cease to whisper what happened inside them. And every time I hear the rain, every time I feel its weight on the windows, I can't help but wonder, what else will have lingered there, in the dark, waiting to be discovered? From the moment I moved into the old building, I knew something wasn't right. There was a lingering dampness in the hallways and a feeling of tightness that was hard to describe. The floors creaked under my footsteps as if complaining about my presence, and the walls seemed to be steeped in years of stories that no one dared to tell. Still, I couldn't afford to be picky. It was an inexpensive apartment and close to the university, so I tried to ignore the initial discomfort. My days went by without any major setbacks, until I noticed something peculiar about my neighbor in apartment number 17. He was a tall, thin man, with an expressionless face and dark eyes that seemed to pierce you if you dared to look directly at him. He always dressed impeccably in sober, perfectly pressed suits, as if he worked in some important office, although I never saw him go out in the mornings. In fact, I hardly ever saw him go out. The first indication that something was wrong came one rainy night, as I was trying to concentrate on reading a book. I had been hearing a constant sound coming from the apartment next door, as if something heavy was being dragged. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the noise persisted for hours, and when I opened the window to try to ventilate, I smelled a strange, nauseating odor that seemed to be seeping from the shared wall. At first, I thought it was a plumbing problem. The building was old, and I wouldn't have been surprised if it had such faults. But the smell was not that of a broken pipe. It was deeper, more penetrating, as if something was rotting on the other side of the wall. I convinced myself that it must be a combination of my fatigue and my imagination, so I decided to ignore it. But over the next few days, that smell became more persistent, and with it my discomfort grew. I began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The apartment windows were always closed, even on the hottest days. Thick curtains prevented any glimpse inside, and I never, not once, heard anyone else in that apartment. There were no visitors, no music, not even the sound of a television. It was as if the place was isolated from the rest of the world. One day, as I was walking down the stairs, I saw him carrying something that looked like a huge trunk to his apartment. He was holding it with both hands, and although at first glance there was nothing strange about it, something about the way he was handling it made me stop for a moment. His expression was cold, distant, and his movements were too methodical, as if he were following a strict protocol. I tried to look away before he noticed that I was watching him, but I couldn't prevent our eyes from crossing. That night, the smell became unbearable. I woke up startled in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was wrong. I got up and walked around my small apartment, trying to locate the source of the stench, but it seemed to emanate directly from the wall I shared with that apartment. It was as if the stench was seeping through the bricks, enveloping everything in its path. My suspicions became an obsession. I began to listen more closely to the sounds coming from that place. Whole days would go by without anything happening, but then suddenly I would hear these noises, shuffling, thudding, as if he was moving heavy furniture or something worse. I called the building management to report the odor, but received nothing but stonewalling. No one wanted to get involved. That's when I decided to do something on my own. I waited for the man to leave, something that rarely happened, and approached his door. It was made of solid wood and was reinforced with a lock that looked new, as if to make sure no one could get in. Then I remembered that a few months ago I had seen a poster of a missing woman posted at the entrance of the building. Then another. Every time I walked past them, I noticed more piling up, as if the neighborhood was being stalked by some unseen danger. And then I got the idea that my neighbor was connected to these disappearances. One day, the rain began to fall heavily, as if the sky was determined to unleash its fury on the city. The weather seemed to synchronize with the tension I felt inside. That night, the stench was so intense that I decided to call the police. I tried to explain to them what I had been noticing, but I could barely articulate coherent words. I could only tell them that something terrible was happening in apartment number 17. When they arrived, the rain was so heavy that the sound of the drops hitting the windows was deafening. The policemen knocked on the door several times, but there was no answer. Finally, they decided to break in. What they found when they entered was not something they were prepared for. Inside, the apartment was completely empty of furniture, and what little there was in disarray. In the center of the room was a metal table covered with surgical tools. The walls were covered with a plastic material, and in one corner a tank of acid bubbled slowly. In that tank, they found human remains. The man in apartment 17 had been disintegrating his victims, hiding the evidence in the building's drainage. They arrested him that same night under the roar of the rain and the flash of red and blue lights. When I saw him handcuffed, his face still expressionless, I felt a mixture of relief and horror. I had been living next door to a human monster, one who had managed to hide his crimes in plain sight for months, perhaps years. Further investigation revealed that he had a carefully calculated routine, and one of his most disturbing habits was his predilection for nightclubs. Although in the building he was an almost invisible ghost, in these places he seemed to transform himself into someone else. He wore impeccable suits and carried an air of mystery that inevitably attracted people. He knew how to talk, how to move, how to present himself as a charming and educated man, someone women could easily trust. It was no coincidence that he chose nightclubs as his hunting ground. Amid the deafening music, flashing lights, and the atmosphere charged with alcohol and diminished confidence, he found the perfect terrain for identifying his victims. He always focused on women who appeared to be alone, either because they had arrived on their own or because their friends had become distracted. His strategy was simple but effective. He offered companionship, pleasant small talk, and made sure to gain their trust with carefully chosen words. Once he identified his target, he would begin his game. He would offer them a ride home if they seemed unable to return on their own, or he would invite them to continue the evening in another, quieter place. He always used the same method. He convinced them that he was someone trustworthy. He was a born actor, a manipulator who knew how to disarm any hint of doubt. The victims never suspected that they were being led directly into the wolf's lair. To them, he was simply an attractive and kind man they had been lucky enough to meet that night. What they didn't know was that the trip to the building would be their last. There, the soundproof walls hid their screams, and the foul smell that emanated afterwards was the only sign of their tragic fate. When police raided the apartment that rainy night, They found evidence linking the man to multiple disappearances reported in recent years. Among the belongings in the apartment were wallets, jewelry, and other personal items of the victims carefully stored as trophies. Nightclubs were his hunting ground, but apartment 17 was his dark sanctuary, the place where his crimes reached their climax. That contrast between the vibrant social life of the clubs and the macabre solitude of his apartment was what made his story even more chilling. He had managed to hide in plain sight, using the noise and distraction of the night world to perpetrate unimaginable acts, becoming a predator lurking in the gloom of humanity. Ever since I started dating Camilla, I felt like my life took a new direction. She was smart, beautiful, and had a way of looking that made me feel like nothing else mattered in the world. For the first few months, everything seemed perfect. I felt lucky to have her by my side, and although I sometimes noticed small cracks in our relationship, I preferred to ignore them. I thought that we all had flaws and that the important thing was the love that united us. But that love, as I was soon to discover, was not as solid as I had imagined. My brother Daniel was also an important part of my life. We were close since we were kids, although our personalities were opposite. While I was always more reserved, Daniel was the life and soul of the gatherings. Outgoing, charismatic, the kind of person who attracted everyone easily. I introduced him to Camilla shortly after our relationship began, and at first everything seemed normal. They got along well, even too well, but I took it as a sign that our relationship had my family's blessing. At first I found it endearing that Daniel and Camilla got along so well. I thought their closeness was an extension of the bond I had with each of them. But over time, small details began to unsettle me. Camilla began to distance herself. Her messages were less frequent, her touches more infrequent, and her excuses for absences became habitual. At the same time, I noticed that Daniel was spending more time at home. He said he was looking for work and preferred to stay with me to save money. Although I appreciated it, I couldn't ignore how his visits coincided with Camilla's visits. I thought I was being paranoid. However, little details kept piling up. Looks that avoided crossing in front of me, evasive comments when I mentioned one in the presence of the other. Something just didn't add up. It was one rainy night when my suspicion began to take shape. I was working late in my office, trying to concentrate as the rain pounded furiously against the windows when I saw Daniel come out of my building. He was dressed more formally than usual and got into a cab. I wouldn't have given it much thought except that just 5 minutes later, I got a text from Camilla saying she wouldn't be able to see me that night. That moment lit a spark in my mind, one that I could not extinguish. I tried to justify it. Maybe Daniel had a social engagement and Camilla was really busy, but the coincidence was too obvious to ignore. I began to watch more closely, taking note of every excuse, every little incongruity. Camilla seemed more and more distant, while Daniel, in contrast, seemed more carefree and comfortable. It was as if they were both acting in a carefully rehearsed play, but whose threads were crossing too conveniently for my liking. Confirmation of my suspicions came days later, when Camilla left her phone unlocked on the table while she went to the bathroom. I'm not the type to go through other people's things, but at that moment I couldn't resist. I opened her messenger and there they were. Conversations between her and Daniel that left no room for doubt. Not only were they talking about their relationship, but there were messages that implied something much worse. Phrases like "this won't be a problem for long" and "soon it will be just you and me" made it obvious that they were planning something. My heart began to pound as I slid my finger across the screen, reading each word in disbelief and horror. But the worst came when I found an attachment, a to-do list. Among them, a disturbing item highlighted in red. Make it look like an accident. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I could not believe that my own brother and the woman I loved were conspiring to murder me. Memories of moments shared with both of them flashed through my mind like a broken film. Every laugh, every embrace, now tinged with a darkness I had never imagined. That night, as the rain came down harder than ever, I knew I could not sit idly by. I went home with my heart beating like a drum, trying not to give any sign of what I knew. Camilla was there acting like it was nothing, while I felt the weight of her lies crushing me. Daniel also showed up later, bringing beers and behaving as if everything was fine. His nonchalance only made his hypocrisy more evident. I locked myself in my room, listening as they both laughed in the living room. Each laugh was like a stab in the back. I grabbed my laptop and transferred all the evidence I had collected to a USB flash drive. I knew I couldn't confront them directly. It was 2 against 1, and they clearly didn't hesitate to resort to extreme measures. I waited until they were both distracted before leaving the apartment. Under the curtain of rain, I headed for the nearest police station. The city was deserted at that hour, and the sound of my footsteps in the puddles seemed amplified by the silence. I felt as if the rain was trying to erase my existence, dragging me into an abyss of paranoia and despair. When I arrived, I explained my situation to the agents. My voice was shaking, but I knew I had to stand my ground. I showed them the screenshots, the list, the messages. As I spoke, I felt the rain outside intensifying the atmosphere as if the world was reflecting the chaos I was experiencing. A few minutes later, officers were sent to my apartment. I decided to stay behind, unable to face Camila and Daniel at that moment. I remained seated in the police station, listening to the sound of the rain and the murmuring of the officers. When they were finally apprehended, it was discovered that they had planned my murder with chilling precision. They had prepared a solid alibi and had a detailed plan to dispose of my body, passing it off as a car accident on a lonely road. They had planned it all while I naively continued to believe in the goodwill of the people I loved the most. Since that night, the rain has taken on a different meaning for me. It used to relax me, make me feel at peace. Now every drop that hits my window reminds me of the darkness that can dwell in the hearts of those we trust the most. I survived his betrayal, but the weight of his disloyalty still haunts me. Sometimes I wonder how I could have been so blind, how love blinded me to the point of not seeing what was in front of me. But I also know that in the darkest moment I made the right decision. I escaped his plans, I denounced his evil, and although the emotional scars will take time to heal, I can live knowing I did the right thing. The rain continues to bear witness to my darkest nights, a reminder that true terror lies not in monsters or ghosts, but in the people we let into our lives and hearts. We lived in a neighborhood that looked like something out of a postcard. Quiet tree-lined streets, well-kept gardens, and neighbors who always greeted us with a smile. My wife Laura and I had chosen this place with the thought of giving our son Tomas a safe and happy childhood. My job as a policeman often kept me on my toes, but at home I could afford to relax, confident that nothing bad could happen here. At least that's what I thought. It all started when Laura started talking about a new colleague in the office, Andres. According to her, he was nice, a bit eccentric, but harmless. At first, his mentions were sporadic, unimportant details about work conversations, but over time, I noticed that Andres became a recurring theme. Her comments about him were ambiguous, a contrast between admiration and a certain discomfort that I didn't know how to interpret at the time. One day, Laura mentioned that Andres had started paying her compliments. Nothing out of the ordinary, she said, playing it down. But to me, something didn't add up. In my line of work, you learn to detect little nuances in the stories you hear, and something in her tone made me feel there was more to it than what she was saying. Over time, her behavior began to change. Laura became more reserved, more tense, especially when talking about her work. One night, while checking emails on her computer, I noticed that she quickly closed the screen when she saw me. I didn't want to invade her privacy, but an uneasy feeling began to settle over me. The worst came one night of torrential rain. The water was pounding furiously against the windows, and the roar of thunder echoed in the empty streets. Tomas was fast asleep in his room, and Laura and I were trying to relax in front of the TV. That's when I heard a noise at the back door. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible in the storm, but my training allowed me to identify it instantly. I got up, trying not to alarm Laura, and went to the kitchen, where the noise was coming from. My hand instinctively rested on my service weapon, a reflection of years of service. The lock was forced, and a trickle of cold air seeped through the half-open door. I felt a shiver run through my body, not because of the cold, but because of what I sensed. I opened the door with a bang, expecting to find a thief, but the silhouette I saw in front of me left me frozen. Andres. His face was drenched, but he seemed unfazed by the rain. His eyes glittered with a mixture of desperation and anger. Something in his expression made me understand that this was not an impulsive act. He had been planning this. He entered quickly, closing the door behind him, and began to move toward me. I tried to remain calm, but his presence was overwhelming. The intensity of his gaze, the way he clenched his fists, told me he was ready for anything. There was more than anger on his face. There was a dark obsession that consumed him. At that moment, I heard Laura scream from the living room. Andres turned his head towards her, and that's when everything changed. His obsession was exposed in an instant. He was there for her, and I was nothing more than an obstacle in his way. Andres moved quickly into the living room, ignoring my presence. Time seemed to stand still as I tried to decide what to do. I didn't want to use my gun, but his attitude left no room for doubt. It was dangerous, and Laura and Thomas were at risk. I stepped between him and Laura, but Andres did not stop. He began to shout incoherently, words that I could barely understand over the roar of the storm. In his mind, Laura belonged to him, and I was the villain standing in the way of his happiness. When he tried to attack me, I had no choice. In an instant that still repeats in my mind like a nightmare, I drew my gun and detonated it. The sound mixed with the roar of thunder, and Andres fell to the ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura stood paralyzed, her eyes full of tears while I tried to assimilate what had just happened. Tomas, awakened by the noise, appeared in the room, and I had to cover his view so he wouldn't see Andres lying there. I called my colleagues at the station, explaining the situation in a trembling voice. When they arrived, the scene was filled with red and blue lights illuminating Andres's pale face. It was then that I learned more about him. Andres suffered from severe bipolar disorder, something that, according to his acquaintances, had led him to develop an unhealthy obsession with Laura. His manic episodes had worsened over time, and not receiving the attention he sought, his mind had begun to crumble. That night changed our lives forever. Although I acted in self-defense and Andres was taken to the hospital for proper care, the weight of having hurt him is something I will never forget. At the time, I did not imagine his disorder nor the reason for his obsession, only the imminent danger he posed to my wife, my son, and me. But later, when the adrenaline wore off and the house returned to silence, that weight fell on me like an impossible slab to lift. Laura and I spent weeks trying to get back to normal. Tomas, despite his young age, understood more than we would like to admit. In his eyes were questions we didn't know how to answer. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" he asked me one night as I tucked him in. I didn't know what to say to him. I just hugged him tightly, as if that could protect him from everything that had happened. The shadow of what happened stayed with us, an invisible specter reflected in the small cracks of our daily lives. Laura stopped working for a while, unable to face the return to her job and the inevitable questions from her colleagues. I, for my part, started working fewer hours, avoiding going out in the evenings. I realized that I was beginning to look at people with suspicion, to analyze every gesture, every glance. My instincts as a policeman, once a tool, became a constant burden. The tranquility of our neighborhood was also shattered that night. Neighbors began to put up stronger locks, install security cameras, and organize meetings to talk about how to keep our streets safe. No one said it openly, but everyone knew that Andres's case had awakened a fear that didn't exist before, the fear that someone close to us could become dangerous. Andres was not a stranger or an intruder, but someone who had shared moments with Laura, someone who seemed harmless until he was not. Eventually, Andres was transferred to a mental health center. His family sent us a letter apologizing for what had happened, explaining that they never imagined his condition would lead him to something so extreme. While I understood their pain, reading those words did not ease my own guilt. It wasn't just the act of shooting, but the loss of an illusion. The idea that I could control what happened around me, that I could protect my family without consequences. That night, I understood that even in the safest home, danger can creep in, silent and deadly. Now, every time I hear the rain pounding, my mind goes back to that night. I think of Andres, how his obsession led him to cross a line he should never have crossed. I remember the look on his face before he shot, a mixture of desperation and determination that haunts me in my dreams. I also think of Laura and Tomas, how I almost lost them, how fragile is the security we take for granted. The rain has become a constant reminder of what happened. Its sound, which I used to find soothing, now puts me on alert. In those moments, I usually get up and walk around the house, checking that the doors are closed, that Tomas is asleep, and that Laura is calm. I realize that I no longer listen to the rain with the same ears. Now its pounding seems to carry a message, the fragility of calm, the reality of the shadows that inhabit the fractured minds of the people around us. But I have also learned something from all of this. Although that night robbed us of some of our peace, it also brought us together as a family. Laura and I, with our emotional wounds still fresh, began to work together to rebuild what we had lost. We supported each other in the process, aware that the real terror had not defeated us. Life goes on, yes, but not without scars. These, while painful, are also a reminder that we fought for what matters most, our family. And although the rain will never be the same for me, neither will the way I see life. Now I value every moment, every laugh from Tomas, every look from Laura. I understood that I cannot control everything, but I can be present, protect, and love more strongly than before. The rain may still fall, but I no longer fear it as before. I have learned to live with its sound, like someone who learns to live with the echo of a storm that, although devastating, did not manage to destroy everything. That night, the rain was falling with overwhelming intensity. The windshield of my car struggled uselessly against the drops that fell with force, turning the road into a river of shadows and distorted reflections. Despite the tiredness I felt after a long day of work, I could not allow myself to close my eyes. I was in the middle of nowhere, on a road winding through a desolate forest, and the only thing I wanted was to get home, take refuge in my living room, and let the warmth of home dissipate the tension accumulated in my body. Without warning, the car began to fail. A slight jerk was the prelude to a dry sound that marked the end of my trip. The tachometer needle slowly dropped as the engine died completely. I tried to start it again, but got no response. Frustrated, I ran a hand over my damp face, unable to tell if the sweat I felt was mine or simply the humidity seeping in from everywhere. I looked around me. There was no sign of life, not a single car passing by on that lost road. I checked my phone in the hope of calling for help, but as expected, I had no signal. The only company I had was the constant sound of the rain hitting the roof of the car and the oppressive darkness that seemed to devour everything. Minutes passed, which turned into hours. Each rainfall against the windows intensified my impatience, my frustration, and something else. A restlessness that I could not explain. There was something strange about that night, in that place. The isolation amplified my senses. Even the rustling of the branches under the weight of the water made me startle. Suddenly, a glow broke the gloom. A pair of lights approached from the distance, reflecting in the puddles that covered the road. My heart flipped between relief and fear. I got out of the car and raised my hand, waving my arms to get the vehicle's attention. A black pickup truck pulled up next to me, its headlights shining so brightly that I had to cover my eyes. The van's engine roared softly as the driver rolled down the window. From the first instant, something about his appearance put me on alert. He was a large man with broad shoulders and a face marked by scars that seemed to tell stories of violence. His eyes were cold, emotionless, and his gaze pierced me as if he could read every thought that went through my head. When I tried to explain my situation, he barely responded with a grunt, pointing toward the back of his truck. It was then that I saw him. Under the dim light escaping from inside, a female figure moved slightly. She was bound, her hands behind her back, and her mouth was covered with duct tape. Her eyes, wide open, reflected an indescribable terror. My breath quickened as I understood the scene in front of me. This man was not a good Samaritan who had stopped his vehicle to help me. He was a predator, and that young woman was his victim. His gaze caught me for an instant, like a silent cry for help. The man noticed where my attention was directed and without hesitation slammed the back door shut, his posture rigid and menacing. My mind was racing frantically. I couldn't let him know I had seen something, but at the same time, every fiber of my being screamed that I must do something. How could I face a man like him, armed only with my wits and the will to survive? As the man pretended to check something in his truck, I tried to stay calm. I looked for something, anything, in the trunk of my car that I could use as a weapon or tool to protect myself, but found nothing useful. Raindrops slid down my face, mingling with the sweat that was now soaking my skin. Time slowed down. Every second seemed like an eternal pulse of tension, until a new light appeared on the horizon. It was dim at first, but quickly grew brighter. A second vehicle was approaching, this time with a familiar pattern of lights. It was a police cruiser. Relief and fear intertwined inside me. The black van, which had seemed so imposing before, was now caught in the patrol car's beam of light. The officers descended from their vehicle with flashlights in hand, illuminating first my car and then the van. The driver tried to maintain his composure, but his nervousness was evident. One of the agents approached the man and asked him to open the back of the van. The refusal was immediate. His excuses were weak, barely coherent. The second officer, noticing the resistance, grabbed his gun and ordered him to step aside. The tension reached a critical point. I felt the air become thicker, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. The agents opened the back door. What they found confirmed my worst fears. The young woman, pale and trembling, was desperately trying to free herself from the restraints. The policeman acted quickly as the man tried to flee, but he didn't get far. The officers had him down in a matter of seconds. His face, once so confident and menacing, now reflected unhinged desperation. The young woman was released and taken to the patrol car, where one of the officers tried to comfort her. Meanwhile, I stood in the rain, watching as the man was handcuffed and loaded into the police car. The black van, now stripped of its menace, looked less intimidating, but no less sinister. When it was all over, the officers approached me to make sure I was okay. Although my car was still broken down and the rain continued to fall relentlessly, none of that mattered. What I had experienced that night left an indelible mark on me. I saw the true face of evil, not in a fictional monster, but in a human being who had crossed all moral lines. The patrol officers called for backup and took the man and the young woman away separately, leaving behind an empty road and a silence that seemed even deeper than before. I was helped by a tow truck, and in my mind I was trying to process everything that had happened. For weeks I couldn't help but relive that night. Every rain patter against the windows of my house brought me back to the instant I saw the young woman's terrified eyes, the man's cold face, and the miraculous arrival of the patrol car. I thought about what might have happened if the police had not arrived. Would I have had the courage to confront the man, or would I have been just another victim? The terror I felt that night was not that of the supernatural. It was the most primitive fear, the one that arises when faced with the capacity for cruelty that exists in human beings. I learned that even in the deepest darkness there are glimmers of hope, which come at just the right moment. Even though life goes on, that night left scars in my memory. Now every time I drive down a lonely road, I can't help but look in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see the lights of a black pickup truck behind me again. The rain keeps falling, both in my memories and in reality, reminding me that true terror doesn't need ghosts or monsters to exist. It is there, lurking in the fractured minds of people who, under certain circumstances, reveal their darker side. I always believed that there was something special about the forest air, something that connected you with nature in a deep and primal way. So when I decided to take Claudia, my fiancée, camping in a secluded place for a weekend, I was convinced it would be an unforgettable experience. Just us, the silence of nature and the stars above our heads. What I didn't know was that that night, under an incessant storm, my life would change forever. We chose a secluded spot near a river surrounded by tall, dense trees, a perfect place to disconnect, away from the distractions of everyday life. Claudia was excited, although she was a little worried about the idea of camping in such a remote place. "Just watch out for the animals," she would tell me, ever so cautious. But I reassured her, assuring her that everything would be fine. We were far from civilization, surrounded by peace and beauty. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, gathered firewood for the campfire, and spent the day hiking the forest trails. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and we prepared for the night. The campfire provided some warmth, and the crackling of the wood was the only thing that broke the absolute silence of the forest. Claudia and I talked about everything, our plans for the future, what we wanted to accomplish. It was a quiet night, perfect in its simplicity. But that tranquility dissipated after dark, when the first raindrops began to fall. At first it was only a few, but soon the storm was unleashed with all its fury. The rain pounded hard on the leaves, the wind howled through the trees, and the sound of the storm surrounded us completely. We hunkered down in the tent, waiting for it to pass. I thought it would be just a passing downpour, but the hours passed and the rain didn't let up. The air became colder, and the humidity was bone-chilling. We settled into our sleeping bags, trying to keep warm, as the sound of the storm outside the tent increased. The rain was pounding on the roof of the tent with an intensity that made it difficult to hear any other sound. We were huddled together, next to each other, trying to stay calm. Claudia, who had been enjoying the atmosphere at first, was beginning to look nervous. "I don't like the sound of those noises," she said, referring to the wind and the strange rustling noises that could sometimes be heard between gusts. I was trying to calm her down, telling her it was just the wind and the storm, but even I was beginning to feel a growing discomfort in the air. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't tell what. The storm continued, and soon the sound of the wind was mixed with other noises, a rustling coming from beyond the tent. At first I ignored it, convinced it was just the natural sound of the forest under the pressure of the storm. But then I heard it again, and this time it was clearer. It wasn't the wind or the trees moving. Someone or something was walking near us. My thoughts churned as I tried to decipher what was happening. I jumped up, pulling the flashlight out of my backpack. The light flickered at first until it finally stabilized, illuminating the tent. I peered through the slits but saw nothing. The trees were swaying in the wind, but there was no sign of life. I couldn't calm down. Claudia was scared, and fear was beginning to grow in my chest. The feeling that we were not alone was overwhelming. I decided to leave the tent to check the surroundings, flashlight in hand. Despite Claudia's protests, who insisted that I should not go out in that storm, I could not just stand there and do nothing. I walked a few meters around the camp, the flashlight illuminating the trees and the mud under my feet. The pouring rain made my vision difficult, and every step I took echoed like a thud in the silence of the storm. Suddenly something caught my attention. There were footprints in the mud, recent footprints, which did not belong to any animal. They were human. A shiver ran through me. We were not alone. Someone else was in the woods with us, and there was no way of knowing if it was someone lost or someone with evil intentions. My mind started racing in all directions, but all I could do was go back to the tent and make sure everything was locked and secure. I ran back to the camp, my heart pounding. Claudia was waiting, nervous. "What's wrong?" she asked, and my voice trembled as I explained what I had seen. We decided to close all the entrances to the tent and wait for the storm to pass, but the feeling of fear persisted. The human footprints were still present in my mind, and the sound of the storm no longer seemed so reassuring. Every rustle, every gust of wind made me think that someone was approaching. The rain did not stop, and the hours passed slowly. The tension increased as the sound of footsteps kept echoing in my mind. Who was out there? What did they want? I was caught in the same uncertainty as Claudia, not knowing if we were being stalked or if it was all a product of our storm-fueled paranoia. In the distance, something glowed in the darkness, a dim light moving. My eyes adjusted, and I saw it. A figure walking through the trees, flashlight in hand. I wasn't sure if it was a lost traveler, a hunter, or something much more dangerous, but something inside me told me that this person shouldn't be there. At that moment, I decided that I couldn't wait any longer. If someone was in the forest with bad intentions, we could not remain defenseless. I left the tent, taking the flashlight and trying to make as little noise as possible. Claudia, seeing me, tried to stop me, but I knew I couldn't risk being surprised. I walked carefully, following the light moving in the distance. The trees seemed to form a labyrinth of shadows, and the wind whipped me hard. Every step I took, I felt something lurking in the shadows. Finally, I came to a clearing in the forest, and there, in the center, I saw the figure I had been following. But as I drew closer, what I saw chilled my blood. It was not a lost traveler or a hunter. It was a man, with a cold, unhinged look. In his hand he held a rope and a knife. Suddenly, everything happened very fast. The man advanced towards me, and in his face there was not a shred of humanity, only evil. My survival instinct prompted me to react. In one swift movement, I jumped to the side, preventing his knife from reaching me. The man lunged at me, but I managed to land a blow that tripped him. At that moment, I felt a stabbing pain in my arm, as if someone had hit me hard. I looked over and saw that Claudia was standing behind him, holding a large stone she had picked up from the ground. The man fell to the ground, stunned by the blow. I took the opportunity to grab him, and in a split second I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to let him kill us. I used the knife in his belt to neutralize him immediately. The blood, fear, and rain mixed into a single whirlwind of chaos. When it was all over, the storm began to cease. The rain gave way to a strange stillness, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Claudia and I looked at each other, exhausted but relieved. We had survived, but somehow we knew that life would never be the same again. As soon as it began to clear, the sky turned pale gray, as if the day was trying to tear away the nightmare of the night, but without success. The storm, though already retreating, left behind a dense and heavy air, which seemed to envelop us and press us with its silence. The sound of our gasping breaths and the quick steps we took on the muddy forest floor were the only things that broke the stillness of the morning. We couldn't stay there a minute longer. Without speaking a word, barely exchanging glances, we grabbed our backpacks and quickly made our way to the car. I felt the weight of everything that had happened on my shoulders, as if the darkness of the previous night had left an indelible mark on our souls. Every rustle of the branches, every movement among the trees made us turn, fearing the worst. We knew that the terror had not yet released us, that we were still being watched by something far greater than our ability to understand. With the car finally in sight, we hurried to get in and, without looking back, started the engine. The wheels rolled over the wet road as we drove away from the place, from the forest, from everything we had experienced. We said nothing during the ride, our minds tethered to what had happened, struggling to process it, to find some logical explanation. But no words were enough. We could find no reason to justify what we had experienced. When we reached the city, the only thing we wanted was to get as far away from everything as possible. We left the camp behind without telling anyone what had happened, as if that act of omission could help us forget what had happened. We never spoke to anyone about what had happened that night, as if the mere mention of it could make it real again. We didn't check the news. We didn't ask about investigations. We were too terrified that the echoes of what happened might reach us, that something or someone might come looking for us. We never knew the truth of what happened in that forest, or who that person was or what he wanted. There were never any reports, never any more news about it. The forest remained there, as dark and as quiet as ever, and we, though alive, could never stop feeling that something was following us, something that we could not see, but that was always right behind us, waiting. It was a dark night, the kind of night when the wind rages like an angry animal and the rain seems to fall with the weight of 1,000,000 lost souls. The storm, which had begun as a faint sizzle at dusk, became a thunderous roar as the hours progressed. The drops were hitting the window panes with a fury that was not normal, and the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the house made me feel as if we were trapped in a nightmare that we could not wake up from. But the worst thing was not the weather, nor the cold seeping through the walls. The worst thing was happening right under our roof. My brother and I had always been very close. We grew up together in that house, sharing childhood memories, mischief, and laughter. He, always the calm and reasonable one, was in charge of the part I had the hardest time with, calming down when life was coming at me. That night, I don't know why, I felt something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way the wind was knocking on the door, or the way the shadows were lengthening longer than usual. Something in the air was charged with a strange tension, and I felt it deep in my bones. My brother was sitting on the couch as usual, watching some program on TV while I was getting ready for bed. The storm was so noisy that it didn't even bother me when I went to bed. The rain lulled me in an unbearably quiet way. Suddenly, the sound of the wind turned into a rustling sound, followed by a dull thud against the door. That's when the terror set in. Before I could react, the front door burst open and 3 dark figures burst into the house. There was no screaming, no time for anything. The men made no noise as they entered, but their presence was like a shadow creeping across the floor. At that moment, my brother got up from the couch, but he didn't manage to take a step before one of them grabbed him by the arms with indescribable force. My mind froze. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything. All I could hear was the rumbling of the storm and the sound of heavy breathing from the intruders. He didn't understand what was going on. There were no demands, no explicit threats, just the sound of rapid footsteps, as if the men knew exactly what they were coming to do. I tried to move, to scream, but I could not. Something kept me trapped, as if fear had sealed my throat. I watched as my brother was dragged toward the door with controlled violence. The men did not rush, but their purpose was clear. This was no robbery, no ordinary kidnapping. It was something much more personal. Only one of the men stood in the doorway staring at me. His eyes glowed with an eerie intensity, as if he could read my thoughts. He didn't say a word, and for a second, I thought maybe he was doing it for fun, enjoying the silent torture he was inflicting on me. But then he turned and followed the other two, disappearing into the storm the same way they arrived, without a trace. The silence that followed was unbearable. I didn't know if fear had rendered me mute or if I had somehow witnessed something so inhuman that I couldn't find words to describe it. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my breathing was so shallow that I feared I would lose it. I ran to the door, but no one was there. Only the storm and the sound of the wind blowing away the footprints of those men. The storm continued to rage. I ran outside, shouting my brother's name, but there was no response. I was alone in the dark, drenched by the rain, staring into the void as despair began to take hold of me. I went back inside, looking for any clue, any sign that might give me an answer. But the house was in complete disarray, as if the intruders had taken their time. But of my brother, not a trace. My first reaction was to call the police, even though I knew there was nothing they could do. By the time they arrived, more than an hour had passed. They asked the usual questions, took some fingerprints, but their faces already showed what I knew. Nothing would change. My brother had disappeared, and I had no idea why or how. The police left, leaving me with more questions than answers. Why had they kidnapped him and not me? Did it have something to do with his work? Hidden debts? I didn't know. Although my brother had always been honest, his life was enigmatic to many. He was a good man, but like everyone else, he had secrets. But I never thought those secrets could lead him to something so terrible. That night, the storm continued. It didn't let up until the wee hours of the morning, and I stood there, in the same chair where I had last seen him, waiting for some sign, some indication that my brother would return. But he didn't. He did not return. The police did their job, but little by little they began to give me vague answers. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. Those three men, so silent and calculating, had disappeared as if they had never existed. The shoe prints they had left in the mud seemed to erase the passage of time. Security searches of the area showed nothing. Everything was a thick fog, as if the storm itself had covered the tracks with its mantle. Days go by and there is no news. The anguish does not die down. On the contrary, it intensifies with every hour that passes without hearing from him. The memories suffocate me. I feel guilty for not having done something, for not having reacted immediately. My brother's face, his confused and terrified look when the men dragged him away, haunts me constantly. I try to hold out hope, but every time I close my eyes, the image of his face disappearing into the darkness digs deeper into me. I don't know if he had enemies, if something from his past caught up with him, if something was hidden that I never knew about. It was never talked about. But something tells me that the storm was not accidental. This was all planned. Maybe even my brother knew about it. But I never had time to ask him. The storm took him away, and now all I have are broken memories and unanswered questions. I don't know if I will ever find the truth. The storm has subsided, but the emptiness in my chest remains the same. And in the stillness of the night, it always seems that something or someone is watching, waiting for me to return to witness another disappearance. My brother is no more, and I, trapped in the fog of oblivion, continue to search for answers, though I fear I will never find them. The storm took everything, even my peace. And every day, despair grows more and more. That night began like any other. Just another shift at the gas station where I had been working for almost 3 years. It was a lonely job, and even more so during the night shift. The constant buzzing of the fluorescent lights, the sound of the windshield wipers on cars coming in to refuel, the endless routine of tending to drowsy or drunk drivers. It was all familiar. The torrential rain falling on the roof of the gas station created an incessant symphony that blended with the noise of passing vehicles. Most of the time, the nights became endless. Only a couple of cars would show up every hour, and in the dark, the service station felt like a forgotten island in the middle of the storm. That night, however, there was something different in the air. A strange, undefined feeling that haunted me from the moment I took my place at the small security booth. The storm was so intense that I could barely see beyond the confines of the station. The rain was coming down with such force that it seemed to want to swallow everything. The puddles on the ground reflected the lights of the establishment in an eerie way. Occasionally, a car would slam on the brakes outside, but everything was eerily calm. The gas station was alone. Most of the other stations were closed or empty at that hour, and here I was stuck in a small booth watching the clock tick slowly, but it always seemed to be in the same place. Then, at about midnight, a van approached. Its headlight illuminated the station sign and made me blink a couple of times to clear my vision. It was a large, dark vehicle with an oddly rumbling engine sound. When it parked near the pump, I felt inexplicably uncomfortable. I couldn't see the driver's face because of the rain that had accumulated on the windows, but something told me I shouldn't approach so fast. I decided to wait, to watch from the window of the booth, not because I wanted to avoid attending to the customer, but because something in the behavior of the vehicle had made me alert. The van remained there for longer than it normally takes someone to refuel. I saw no movement inside, and it was that silence, that stillness, that really made me uncomfortable. A few minutes passed, and as the rain continued its relentless fury, I saw the figure of a man get out of the van. He was covered with a black jacket and hat, and his bearing, the way he moved, gave me a sense of alarm, a sense of imminent danger that I could not explain at the time, but which gripped me strongly. The man approached the gas dispenser, but he did not go to the pump as any normal customer would. Instead, he slowly approached toward my booth. My heart began to pound, the feeling that something wasn't right intensifying more and more. My mind, fueled by horror movies and crime stories from my hometown, began to generate the worst assumptions. The man stopped right in front of the stall window. His shadow cast on the glass made me break out in a cold sweat. He didn't say anything, he just stood there watching me. Something in his gaze, something in his posture was not normal. It was as if he was studying me, evaluating my every move. The rain continued to pound the roof furiously, but to me, everything seemed plunged into a strange silence, as if the world had ceased to exist outside that station. I stood still, fearful of making the wrong move, knowing that any action could trigger the worst. Suddenly, without warning, the man raised his hand and hit the window hard. The sound of the knock echoed through the stall, making me jump in my seat. I forced myself to breathe, trying to remain calm, but my mind was filled with dark thoughts. At the time, I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. I wanted to call the police, but the line was dead, probably due to the storm. The signal had been down for a few minutes. I was trapped, all alone, with no way to call for help. I decided it was best to be cautious. I looked around for any object I could use as a defense in case things got worse, but I was completely unarmed. There was only a small lamp in the corner of the hut. The man said nothing. He just continued to watch me. A few seconds passed that seemed like hours until he finally took a step back and walked away from the window. My breathing relaxed for a second, but I soon realized that I couldn't let my guard down. I knew something else was about to happen. I looked out the window and watched him walk to the back of the van, where something in the back seat caught my attention. I saw a lump, a human figure covered with a blanket. My heart stopped for a moment, and I understood what was happening. That figure in the back seat was not just a lump. It was a person, and it couldn't be good news. The man returned to the front of the van, and I saw him pull something out of his jacket. I couldn't see exactly what it was, but the metallic sheen reflecting off the station lights made me realize it wasn't something I wanted to look at any closer. A knife. Terror immediately enveloped me. At that moment, I felt a shiver run through my body. I was trapped in that small hut with no chance of escape, while an armed man stood outside. My mind began to search for ways to survive. The option of running out to the warehouse next to the station seemed like the most direct path, but I also knew I had no idea what else might be there, or how many other men might be involved. Suddenly, I felt like everything was about to fall apart. The man approached the stall window again, this time with a macabre smile on his face. He stared at me, his gaze cold and calculating as he began to walk toward the door of my stall. I had no choice. I had to get out of there. I ran to the back door of the hut, but before I could open it, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching rapidly. Suddenly, the front door of the hut flew open and the man appeared again, this time with the knife in his hand. My mind thought of nothing else but running. I ran to the tool shed, rushed inside without looking back. The sound of the man's footsteps kept echoing in my head, and I felt panic take over my body. I dropped to the ground, my breathing ragged, the noise of the storm drowning out everything else. My hands were shaking as I tried to stay calm, but the adrenaline and fear wouldn't let me think clearly. I was sure he had followed me, that he had seen me enter the shed. Every footstep I heard outside, every rustle in the rain made my heart beat faster. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the space through the small slits in the wooden walls, and I saw him. His shadow was cast across the dirty windows of the shed. He had arrived. My whole body tensed, trying not to make a sound. I had no idea how long I could hold on. All I wanted to do was to get out of there, but I couldn't. The sound of his footsteps suddenly ceased. The absolute silence made me feel as if the whole world had ceased to exist, as if only he and I were left, facing each other in a deadly game. I was too close. The sound of wind and rain mingled with the rustle of leaves, but I felt like everything else was gone. Only the two of us existed. I took a deep breath and slowly stood up. Tools hung on the walls around me. I looked toward the windows, but the man was nowhere in sight. An impulse led me to creep toward the back door of the shed, hoping that if I could get out of there quietly, I could escape. But fear still gripped my chest, and the rain made everything worse, hindering any quick movement. Suddenly, the sound of a loud bang made me jump. The shed door. He had opened it. My heart stopped for a second, and before I could react, a shadow slipped inside, his dark figure like an imminent threat. I couldn't let him catch me. A frantic impulse led me to grab the first tool I found within reach. A hammer. I wielded it with both hands, ready to defend myself at all costs. At that moment, I thought of nothing else, only of surviving. The figure of the man advanced, and I could see his face through the rain, the mask of despair and fury he wore. He was too close. A second later, I threw a blow at him, but he quickly dodged the hammer. The violence of his reaction sent me skidding, and I fell to the ground. But my survival instinct pushed me to roll over and get to my feet almost instantly. I saw the door, my only way out, right in front of me. I ran towards it with all my might, without stopping, without looking back. The rain lashed me hard as I ran down the track to the gas station, the sound of their footsteps chasing me behind. My lungs burned, and the pain in my legs warned me that I couldn't run for long. But I couldn't stop. I had to get to the main street. Finally, in the distance, I saw the lights of a car approaching. It was my chance. I screamed, raising my hands, praying that someone would see me. I saw the vehicle slow down, and my hope increased. As I got closer, the driver of the car accelerated and began to brake, but I didn't get to see his face, only his vehicle, which swerved toward my position. With a stroke of luck, the car braked right next to me. Without thinking, I opened the back door and quickly climbed inside. The storm was still raging outside, but I was safe now. I looked back, but the man was no longer in sight. The driver looked at me worriedly, but I was too exhausted and stunned to say anything. The road was still empty, and with each passing kilometer, I felt my fear begin to fade. But one thing was certain. The gas station was behind me, and my life remained a mystery. No one knew what had happened that night. The storm was slowly clearing, and with it, the sense of dread that had been with me all that time. That night, what I experienced I would never forget. But they never talked about it again. Nobody believed me, neither the police nor the driver of the car that rescued me. After all, there was no evidence, no traces. There was only fear. Working in a nightclub is not what many people imagine. They say it's a place full of music, lights, and fun, but the truth is that most of us who pass by every day no longer see those lights as something fascinating. I, in particular, saw it as just another job, something I did to make ends meet. I didn't care too much about what went on inside the club as long as I was doing my shift, and nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But that night, what seemed to be a quiet, rainy night, everything changed, and I realized that in a place like that, danger doesn't always take the form of what we see with the naked eye. It was a stormy night, the kind of storm that made people seek shelter anywhere. Outside, the rain was pounding on the windows as if trying to break them. The lights in the club, always bright and intense, were flickering due to the strong wind blowing. The dance floor was full of patrons, some more animated than others, but most were enjoying the music while sipping drinks. I was at my usual post near the bar watching everything that was going on. My job was simply to keep watch, to keep an eye out for anything out of the ordinary, but I never imagined that this night would turn into a nightmare. The first signs that something was wrong came without warning. A shiver ran down my spine when I noticed that the atmosphere had changed. At first, I couldn't identify exactly what was causing it, but the energy in the place was different. The customers seemed more tense, the conversations were lower, and some people's gazes crossed each other with a kind of inexplicable uneasiness. The neon lights, which always gave a festive air, began to flicker erratically, and the sound of the music became more distant, as if trapped under a thick layer of fog. It was then that I saw them. 4 men, their faces hidden under caps and scarves, entered the club as if they had melted into the darkness falling over the city. They were not regulars, of that I was sure. My instinct told me something wasn't right, but I tried to remain calm. After all, there were always strange people in the club, and there was never a shortage of out-of-place characters. However, something about their presence made me uncomfortable. They were walking briskly with a determination that was not that of an ordinary group. Each of them carried a backpack, which they pulled out as they entered, as if they were ready for something, but I still didn't know what. The tension in the air increased with each step they took. The first of them, the tallest, walked to the center of the dance floor, while the other 3 distributed themselves to the sides. The customers at first didn't seem to realize what was happening, and that was the worst part. No one knew what to do, no one dared to move. The man in the center took a step forward and with a quick movement pulled a gun out of his jacket. It was not just any gun, it was a large caliber revolver, which he pointed at the ceiling and fired a couple of shots. The sound of the shots echoed in my ears, and immediately everything froze. The club was plunged into absolute silence. No one moved, no one breathed. Everyone stayed in place, as if they were expecting everything to be a nightmare from which they would wake up at any moment. Panic quickly set in. People started screaming, some tried to duck, others ran for the exits, but there was something else, something that paralyzed me. The other 3 men approached the bar where we employees were standing, staring in fear at what was happening. One of them, the smallest of the 4, had a gun in each hand. He pulled it out and with quick movements ordered us all to lie down on the floor. I, of course, obeyed. I knew I had no choice. The gunshots echoed in the background, but worst of all was the silence that followed each one. With each passing second, I felt more trapped, smaller in the midst of the darkness the men had brought with them. As I lay there on the floor, I couldn't stop thinking about the customers, about my coworkers, about my family. No one knew what was happening. No one knew what we were going to do. Suddenly, one of the men started shouting orders. He was looking for something I didn't understand at the time. He looked at the people one by one and forced them to stand up. No one dared to resist. There was no more room for struggle. We were trapped, completely at their mercy. I realized that the storm outside wasn't the only thing choking me. There was something in the air, something much heavier than the rain, something that was pressing against my chest, that was suffocating me. The other 2 men were in charge of emptying the customers' backpacks and collecting everything that could be taken. There was no logical reason for the chaos that was unleashed in front of my eyes. I just wanted it all to be over, for the nightmare to end somehow. The lights flickered louder. The echoes of the storm mingled with the sounds of screams and the crunching of broken glass. I was so focused on what was happening in front of me that I didn't even notice when one of the men moved closer in my direction. He pointed the revolver at me and ordered me to get up. I tried to remain calm, but terror had completely overtaken me. I knew that if I tried to do anything wrong, if I moved too much, it would all be over in a second. My mind was racing, looking for a way to escape. Looking for a way to save myself, but I couldn't find any way out. The man dragged me to the back of the club where the other 2 were waiting for him. I knew that at any moment they could shoot me, that any attempt to try anything could be the end of me. And then what happened was even worse. The man who had been controlling everything began to talk to his companions. I didn't know what they were saying, but something in their tone made me realize that they were about to leave the place. Somehow they were going to leave without a trace. The others quickly dispersed, and in a couple of minutes the club was empty. The rain was still pounding on the windows, but now the silence was absolute. Not a single footstep, not a single sound could be heard. The nightmare was over, but the fear still remained. Officers arrived shortly thereafter, but did not find the men. They found no trace of them anywhere. It was as if they had never existed. The club eventually returned to normal, but I could never forget what had happened that night. That feeling of being trapped, of not knowing if you would make it out alive, never went away. The storm ended, but the echo of fear was etched in my mind forever. And although the club was back to business as usual, I could never feel safe again. Because I knew that in a place like that, danger is always lurking. waiting for the right moment to appear. I have always been a lover of technology. Rainy nights like the one that was coming that day were perfect to stay at home, with the sound of the drops hitting the ceiling, while I surfed aimlessly on the internet. My job, though routine, left me no time for many hobbies, and these late-night sessions in front of the computer had become my escape. The storm started early. The sound of the wind mingled with distant thunder, and the rain seemed to lash the city with fury. I closed the curtains, turned on my desk lamp, and opened my computer. At that time of night, the forums and pages I frequented were a haven of harmless entertainment. Nothing out of the ordinary, just one click after another, absurd videos, forum discussions, and articles on topics that didn't really matter. But that night, something was different. I don't know how I got there. My memories are fuzzy as to the exact moment I hit the click that changed everything. What I do know is that the page I ended up on was unlike any page I'd ever seen before. It was stark, bleak, with an awkward layout and red letters that seemed to scream warnings that I ignored. I thought maybe it was just another one of those forums that explore the dark corners of the web, a space for conspiracy theories or bizarre content. However, something on that page disturbed me from the beginning. The black background, the fuzzy images of unfamiliar faces, and a strange feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching me through the screen. There was a single link highlighted in the center of the page with text in large letters that said something like, "Come in and see the truth." I don't know what prompted me to click. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom. But I did. The screen went completely black for a moment, and I thought the page was not loading. Suddenly, a pop-up window appeared. It was a video. The quality was bad, as if it had been filmed with an old camera or in a place without adequate light. At first, I couldn't make out much, just shadows and the faint flicker of a fluorescent light. I could hear the sound of water droplets falling, as if someone was in a damp basement. My heart began to race for no apparent reason. It wasn't anything explicit yet, but the atmosphere in the video was oppressive. Something was not right. A few seconds passed before a figure appeared on the screen. It was a man, dressed in dirty overalls and a mask covering his face. He was walking slowly through an empty room, carrying what appeared to be a handheld camera. My breathing stopped for a moment when I saw the camera focus on something else. A chair in the center of the room. In it, a woman was tied up. Her hair partially covered her face, but she was clearly frightened. Her movements were clumsy, as if she were drugged or too weak to resist. The man in the mask stopped in front of it, leaving the camera fixed on a tripod pointing directly at the scene. My fingers trembled as I tried to close the browser window, but it was unresponsive. It was as if the page was locked, trapping me there. I wanted to turn off the computer, but something in me forced me to keep looking, as if my mind was torn between fear and a morbid curiosity I couldn't control. Then it happened. The man pulled a long knife out of his pocket and began to speak. There was no sound on the video, but his gestures were clear. He was taunting her, enjoying her power. Suddenly, he raised the knife and the woman began to shake, desperate. I tried to look away, but my eyes were glued to the screen. The knife came down and blood splattered on the walls. My body was completely paralyzed. The video continued, but I couldn't understand it. I could only see the horror, the violence, the absolute brutality of what was happening in front of me. I felt nauseous. I thought I would faint. I tried again to close the browser, but I couldn't. The window was still there, as if it had become part of the screen. The window was still there, as if it had become part of the screen. It was as if the video wanted me to watch it all the way through. I don't know how long I kept watching. The storm outside intensified, and the noise of the thunder seemed to synchronize with the images that kept playing in front of me. The truth is, the video ended abruptly. The screen went black, and for a moment I thought it was all over. But then, a message appeared in the center of the screen. "You have seen. You are now a part of this." It was as if the message was addressed directly to me. I slammed the computer shut, breathing hard. I felt like the air in the room had become thick, unbreathable. That night I did not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face, I saw the blood, I heard the sounds, even though the video never had them. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about the man with the mask and that final message. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about the man with the mask and that final message. Who were they? What did it mean to be part of this? I wondered if anyone else had seen the same thing, if I was alone in this abyss of fear. The next few days were a torment. Every time I turned on my computer, I felt like something was watching me. I stopped using the internet altogether, but even away from the screen, I couldn't escape the images. There was no way to erase them from my mind. I couldn't talk about it with anyone. How could I explain something so horrible without them thinking I was crazy? But the worst part was knowing that what I had seen was real. That woman was dead. I had witnessed something I should not have seen. Rainy nights like the one that seemed so common at first now filled me with an inexplicable terror. The sound of the drops was no longer soothing, but a reminder of the silence that accompanied the horror of that night. And most disturbing was the feeling that, somewhere, the man in the mask knew that I had been there, that I had seen his work. We had been planning this vacation for months. My wife Sarah and I were excited to give our 2 children, Mateo and Rosa, a full week of rest away from the routine. We had chosen a picturesque hotel in the mountains surrounded by forests and with a spectacular view of the lake. The reviews on the internet described it as cozy and familiar, a perfect place to relax. We arrived on a Sunday afternoon with clear skies and fresh air that promised quiet days. But little did we know what awaited us. The first few days were pleasant. We explored the nearby trails, the children played in the playground, and the evenings were calm. However, on the 3rd day, the weather changed drastically. A storm blew over the valley, with rain so heavy that it nearly blotted out the landscape in front of our windows. It was Tuesday night, and even though we were cooped up in the room because of the bad weather, I didn't care. I was happy to be with my family. At about 10 o'clock at night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a strange noise in the hallway as if someone was dragging something heavy. At first I ignored it, thinking it was guests moving luggage, even though it was an unusual time to do so. But the noises didn't stop. They were constant, accompanied by thumping noises that seemed to be coming from downstairs. An uncomfortable feeling began to settle in my chest, but I said nothing so as not to alarm Sarah, who was already sleeping soundly. At midnight, a flash of lightning illuminated the room for a few seconds, and the electricity was cut. Rosa and Mateo woke up frightened, whimpering in their beds. I tried to calm them, turning on a flashlight we had in the luggage. In the silence of the storm, the noises became more evident. This time they were coming not only from the hallway, but also from the next room. It sounded like someone was banging on the wall in desperation. I decided to go out to investigate, making sure the door was securely closed behind me. The hallway was dark, barely illuminated by the flashlight. The atmosphere was oppressive, the air thick with a metallic smell that I could not immediately identify. I walked slowly toward the room where the knocking was coming from. The door was ajar, something that struck me as odd considering that all the guests should be locked in due to the bad weather. As I pushed open the door, the flashlight illuminated a scene that chilled me. The room was empty, but on the floor were fresh stains of what looked like blood. The sheets were ripped off the bed and thrown on the floor, along with personal items that appeared to have been abandoned in a hurry. Before I could process what I was seeing, a loud bang echoed behind me, making me turn immediately. The hallway was empty, but I could have sworn I heard rapid footsteps moving away toward the stairs. My instinct told me something was terribly wrong. I ran back to our room, locking the door behind me. I didn't want to alarm Sarah, but when I told her what I had seen, her face paled. We agreed it wasn't safe to stay there, but with the storm blocking the roads and the power out, leaving the hotel wasn't an immediate option. A couple of hours passed in which we tried to stay calm, hugging the children and making sure they didn't panic. But then, the knocking came again, this time closer. They seemed to be coming from our door. Sarah and I looked at each other, and with a knot in my stomach, I went over to look through the peephole. No one was there, but the pounding continued, now louder and more desperate. I made an impulsive decision. I threw open the door, hoping to confront the person responsible, but the hallway was empty. The flashlight illuminated the damp corridor from some leak, but there was no sign of anyone. It was then that I noticed something on the floor, a crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up and read it under the flickering light of the flashlight. It was a hastily written message. "Get out of here before dawn." My heart began to pound. I didn't know if the message was a warning or a threat, but I couldn't ignore it. I showed the note to Sarah, and although we tried to remain calm for the children, the fear was clearly reflected on our faces. As we were discussing what to do, we heard another noise. This time it came from downstairs, a muffled scream followed by the sound of breaking glass. I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I asked Sarah to stay with the children and not to open the door under any circumstances while I went downstairs to find out what was going on. Every step I took filled me with uncertainty. The staircase creaked under my weight, and the echo of the storm outside made everything even more unsettling. When I arrived in the lobby, it was completely deserted. The reception area was empty, and the common area, which used to be bright and welcoming, seemed cold and abandoned under the dim emergency lighting. But the most disturbing thing was what I saw as I approached one of the windows, a black van parked near the entrance, with the lights off and the engine running. My thoughts stopped when I heard voices coming from a back door. I approached carefully and saw something I will never forget. 3 men with covered faces were dragging what appeared to be a body wrapped in a sheet. One of them was carrying a gun, while the others were arguing in low voices. My breath quickened. I had fallen into a place that hid something much darker than I could have imagined. I backed away slowly, taking care not to make a sound, but my foot stumbled over something and a small noise echoed in the silence. One of the men raised his head, directing his gaze into the darkness where I was hiding. I didn't wait to find out if they had seen me. I ran up the stairs, ignoring the noise I was making in my desperation. When I got to our room, Sarah was waiting for me with her eyes full of fear. I quickly explained what I had seen, and we knew we couldn't wait until dawn. We hurriedly grabbed our things and woke the children. We tried to make as little noise as possible as we headed for the emergency stairs. The walk to the exit took forever. The corridors seemed to lengthen with every step, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Finally, we reached the back door of the hotel, which led to the parking lot. The black van was still there, but there was no sign of the men. We ran to our car in the pouring rain. My hands were shaking as I tried to start it, but to our luck, the engine roared at the first attempt. We sped away without looking back as the hotel disappeared into the darkness. We never reported what we saw that night. Part of me felt that no one would believe us, and another part just wanted to forget it ever happened. However, every time I hear the rain pounding against the windows, I can't help but relive that night. I wonder how many more secrets that hotel hides and how many people were not lucky enough to escape. That night of heavy rain marked a before and after in my life as a father. I never imagined that the deepest fear would not come from something external, but from the betrayal of someone to whom I entrusted the most precious thing, my children. Since the divorce, life had been a constant balancing act. My children's mother, tired of our relationship and looking for a fresh start, had moved to another city, leaving me with the full responsibility of caring for our 2 young children. Santiago, 8 years old, was a curious and mature child for his age. Jason, the youngest, only 5 years old, was more reserved, sweet, and dependent. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. So when I interviewed Marina, the nanny, I thought I had found the ideal person. Marina had something in the way she spoke, a calmness and gentleness that won me over immediately. She had worked with several families, and her references seemed impeccable. She was sympathetic to my situation, with a smile that inspired confidence. She was just what we needed, someone to bring us stability in the midst of chaos. But, as I learned too late, appearances can be deceiving. For the first few weeks, everything seemed to go well. The children seemed comfortable with her, especially Jason, who rarely opened up to strangers. Marina was efficient, organized, and attentive. She cooked healthy meals, kept the house in order, and spent time playing with the children. But as the days went by, small details began to raise suspicions in me, although at the time I didn't think much of them. I noticed that Jason, who used to be very expressive with me, began to withdraw a little. When I asked him how his day with Marina had been, he would answer with monosyllables or divert the conversation. Santiago, on the other hand, seemed distant with her, something unusual considering his sociable personality. But my mind was saturated with work and responsibilities, and I convinced myself that these were just normal adjustments. That night began like any other. It had been raining all day, and the storm seemed to intensify as night fell. After dinner, I went up to my office on the 2nd floor to finish up some unfinished business while Marina took care of the kids. The house was quiet, except for the sound of water and thunder echoing in the distance. Around midnight, a dull thud brought me out of my concentration. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me stop. I thought maybe it was the wind moving something outside, so I tried to ignore it. But a second noise, this time clearer, forced me to get up. I went down the stairs carefully, trying not to alarm anyone. The room was empty and the lights were off. I looked down the hallway that led to the children's rooms and felt a fear run through my body. The front door was ajar, letting the cold, damp air from the storm seep into the house. That's when I heard a third noise, this time coming from outside. I stepped out onto the porch, and what I saw shocked me. Through the curtain of rain, I made out a figure running toward the car parked in the driveway. It was Marina, and in her arms, she was carrying Jason, wrapped in a blanket. My son was motionless, as if asleep. But something about the way she was holding him struck me as alarming. Time seemed to stand still as my mind processed what I was seeing. What was she doing? Why was she carrying him like that? Without a second thought, I ran towards them, shouting their name, but the storm drowned out my words. Marina stopped for a moment, turned her head towards me, and in her eyes I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a terrifying coldness, a total lack of empathy. My heart pounded as I approached, but she reacted quickly, opening the car door and trying to pull Jason inside. Adrenaline drove me. I don't know where I got the strength, but I managed to intercept her before she could start the car. There was a struggle. She tried to push me, but I managed to snatch my son from her arms. When I had him with me, I noticed that he was still breathing, although he looked dazed, as if he had been sedated. Marina, instead of trying to retrieve him, stared at me for a few seconds. It was a look I will never forget, full of hatred and determination. Then, without a word, she ran off into the darkness, losing herself in the rain and the trees surrounding the house. I ran back inside with Jason in my arms, making sure to lock the door behind me. My heart was still beating uncontrollably as I laid him down on the couch. Santiago came running downstairs, awakened by the noise, and helped me check to make sure his brother was okay. Although he was scared, he seemed to understand the seriousness of what had happened. I spent the rest of the night watching my children. Every sound, every shadow that moved made me jump. I didn't know if Marina would return, if she was alone, or if there was someone else involved in her plan. All I knew was that this woman, whom I had led into my home, had tried to take my son, and I didn't understand why. When the sun came up, I called the police. I told them what happened, but they had no record of Marina. Her ID, the references, everything was false. It was as if she had never existed. I never knew what her intentions were, what she planned to do with my son, or if she had done anything similar before. The authorities searched for clues, but the storm had erased any trace. She simply disappeared without a trace, taking all the answers with her. From that night on, my life changed completely. I never trusted anyone outside my close circle again. I became an overprotective parent, always vigilant, always alert. And although over time the wounds began to heal, the fear never completely disappeared. The image of Marina in the rain, taking my son away, still haunts me, because I know that there are people like her in the world, people who hide behind a mask of normality, waiting for the right moment to destroy someone else's life. It was a stormy night, one of those when the rain knocks on the door as if it were trying to get in, as if it had something urgent to tell. My name is Lucas, and I am not a man who scares easily. However, what happened that night several years ago haunts me like a shadow, a constant reminder that true evil needs no disguises or supernatural creatures. Humans and their dark desires are enough. I lived in a small town, a place where everyone thought they knew each other. The familiar faces gave a false sense of security. We were not rich, but neither were we in dire need. My life was routine. I worked in a mechanic's shop and spent my evenings at home, watching television or reading some old book. I lived alone in a modest house inherited from my parents, who had passed away several years ago. That house, which had been my refuge, became the scene of my worst nightmare. The afternoon began with the sky darkening earlier than usual. Thunder rumbled like distant warnings as I closed up the shop and headed home. I knew the storm would be strong. The air had that damp weight that presses down on your chest. As I drove through the deserted streets, I couldn't help but feel a strange nervousness, an uneasiness I couldn't quite put my finger on. Something didn't fit, but I didn't know what. I arrived home just as the rain began to fall heavily. I made myself a simple dinner and turned on the television, hoping that the sound of the screen would distract me from the noise of the storm. As the hours passed, the rain intensified, turning the streets into makeshift rivers. Suddenly, the sound of a loud knock brought me out of my thoughts. It seemed to be coming from the back door of the house. I got up cautiously, thinking that maybe the wind had moved something. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the source of the noise. The back door was ajar. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was always very careful with locks, especially on a night like that. Something wasn't right. The light from the flashlight cut through the darkness as I surveyed the backyard. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I locked the door and made sure all the windows were secured. I returned to the living room, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It was close to 10 o'clock at night when the second knock occurred, this time on the living room window. It was a thud, as if something or someone had thrown something against the glass. I immediately turned off the TV and stood silently listening. The storm was still raging outside, but there was something else, something my instinct could not ignore. Suddenly the phone rang. The noise made me jump and my heart was beating so fast I could hardly breathe. I answered, hoping to hear a familiar voice, but the line was dead. Only the sound of static accompanied me. It was then that I realized that someone was playing with me. My mind began to analyze all the possibilities, a burglar, a group of bored teenagers. But the knock on the window and the phone call seemed too calculated to be a simple prank. I decided to call the police, but when I picked up the receiver again, the line was still dead. My only option was to stand by and wait out the storm. I went to my room and took out a baseball bat that I kept in my closet. It was the only thing I had to defend myself. I turned on all the lights in the house and sat in the living room trying to stay calm. But then, the sound I feared most came. Footsteps. They weren't coming from outside. They were footsteps inside the house. Fear paralyzed me for an instant, but then I got up slowly, with the bat in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The steps were light, careful, as if the person was trying not to be detected. My mind was racing, trying to decipher how someone had entered without me noticing. I followed the sound to the kitchen, where one of the windows was slightly open. I couldn't remember if I had closed it before or not. Shining a light on the floor, I noticed wet footprints leading down the hallway. My heart hammered in my chest as I moved forward slowly, trying not to make a sound. When I reached the hallway, the footprints disappeared into the basement door. That door was always locked, but now it was wide open. A draft of cold air was rising from below, bringing with it a metallic smell that I couldn't identify. I plucked up my courage and descended the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The basement was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. There was no sign of anyone being there, but the smell was stronger. It was a smell of rust, mixed with something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw something that shocked me. On one of the walls, someone had written in red paint, "I'm watching you." Fear turned to pure panic. I climbed the stairs as fast as I could, closed the basement door, and secured it with a heavy piece of furniture. But before I could catch my breath, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A man's low, guttural laughter coming from somewhere in the house. I ran to the front door, but it was locked from the outside. Someone had blocked all my exits. At that moment, I understood that whoever it was not there to steal. This was personal. He was playing with me, enjoying my fear. I decided that if I was going to get out of that house, it wouldn't be as a victim. I hid in a closet near the entrance, hoping to hear some movement. The minutes passed slowly, each one more unbearable than the last. The rain kept pounding on the windows and thunder echoed in the house, increasing my tension. But then everything went silent, not a sound, as if the storm itself had stopped to watch. Suddenly, the closet door burst open, and there he was, a tall man, his face covered by a black mask. Before I could react, he pushed me to the floor. I tried to get up and use the bat, but he was stronger than me. He pinned me down, and in a calm voice but full of contempt, he whispered, "I warned you." I don't know how I did it, but I managed to hit him in the side with the bat and run into the kitchen. My only way out was a window overlooking the backyard. I struggled it open as he slowly approached, enjoying my desperation. I jumped out into the pouring rain and ran without looking back. When I arrived at my neighbor's house, I was soaking wet and shaking. They called the police, who arrived shortly thereafter. When I returned with the officers, the house was empty. There was no sign of the man. but the message in the basement was still there like a macabre taunt. They never found the intruder, and I never felt safe in my own home again. Sometimes on stormy nights I still feel his presence. I wonder if he will ever come back, if he was playing with me or if he had a darker purpose. All I know is that night taught me a lesson I will never forget. True terror needs no masks. It was a night of heavy rain, the kind that seems to blot out every sound in the world except the constant pattering of the drops against the ground. The streets were empty, and the lights on the poles shone timidly through the fog. My name is Daniel. I am not a person who would consider myself brave, but what I experienced that night marked me in a way that I could never erase. If I close my eyes, I can still hear the rain mixed with the echo of screams. I can still feel the weight of fear crushing my chest. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, a place where time seemed to move slowly. Most of the neighbors were young families or old people who had been there all their lives. I was a single man in my 30s, dedicated to my job as a data analyst. My life was routine and predictable, and I liked that. But the tranquility of the neighborhood hid secrets that none of us could have imagined. That night, I had arrived late from work due to the traffic caused by the storm. The water was coming down so hard I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I finally arrived home, soaking wet despite having run from the car to the door. I dropped the briefcase on the floor and headed straight for the kitchen to heat up some food. As the microwave whirred, I turned on the TV, looking for something to fill the oppressive silence in the house. I was sitting on the sofa, watching a random program without much interest, when I heard a thud. It was coming from the house next door. It was as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. My neighbors were an older couple, the Garcias. They had lived there for decades, always friendly and quiet. I thought that maybe the noise was a product of the storm, something moved by the wind. I didn't think much of it. Minutes later, a second noise made me get up from the couch. This time it was louder, a sound that echoed like an echo in the rainy night. I walked over to the window, pulling aside the curtain slightly to look out into the Garcia house. All the lights were off except for a faint flickering light in the living room. Something didn't feel right. The rain was still coming down hard when I decided to go out. I had no umbrella, just a light jacket that quickly became soaked. I crossed the small garden that separated our houses and approached the Garcia's front door. It was ajar. That was strange. They always locked everything. I knocked softly, hoping someone would answer, but all I heard was the sound of rain and wind pouring through the doorway. I pushed the door carefully, and what I saw as I entered made my heart stop for an instant. The room was in complete disarray. Overturned furniture, torn cushions, and papers scattered on the floor. The chandelier hanging from the ceiling swayed slightly, casting irregular shadows on the walls. It was as if a chaotic force had passed through, leaving its mark on every nook and cranny. I advanced cautiously, feeling that each step brought me closer to something I did not want to discover. Then I saw it. Mr. Garcia's body was on the ground, in a pool of blood that mixed with the rainwater coming in through a broken window. His face was disfigured, as if someone had hit him repeatedly with a blunt object. I felt nauseous, but I couldn't look away. My first thought was to look for Mrs. Garcia. Maybe she was hiding. Maybe she had managed to escape. I walked around the house, calling out to her in a low voice, hoping that all this had some logical explanation. But what I found in the kitchen erased any hope. Mrs. Garcia was tied to a chair with a gag covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide open, filled with a terror that could not be described in words. Someone had killed her in a brutal way, and the scene was so violent that I had to look away. My whole body trembled, not only from the cold of the rain, but from the horror that unfolded before me. My instinct told me to run away, to call the police and let them take care of it. But before I could react, I heard footsteps. They weren't coming from the street, but from inside the house. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if whoever was there knew exactly where to step. I ran into the living room, looking for a place to hide. I took shelter behind an overturned piece of furniture, trying to control my breathing as the footsteps approached. The figure of a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, dressed completely in black, with a ski mask hiding his face. He carried a knife in one hand and in the other a small briefcase that looked heavy. The man surveyed the room, moving the furniture around calmly as if he were looking for something. I stood motionless, praying he wouldn't find me. Finally, he moved toward the front door and disappeared in the rain. I waited a few minutes before emerging from my hiding place, making sure the intruder was gone. I ran back to my house, soaking wet and my heart pounding. I called the police, stuttering as I tried to explain what I had seen. I gave them my address and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. As I waited, I couldn't stop thinking about the Garcias. Why would anyone do such a horrible thing? What could they have done to deserve such a fate? When the police arrived, I told them everything I knew. They searched the Garcias' house and confirmed what I had already feared. They were both dead, and the intruder had taken something important from the place. What disturbed me the most was what one of the officers told me before leaving. This was no ordinary robbery. This guy knew what he was looking for. The following days were a whirlwind of interrogation and speculation. The police discovered that the Garcias had been involved in something no one in the neighborhood could imagine. Apparently, they had witnessed a crime years before and had kept evidence in their home, thinking it would never be discovered. But someone found out, and that night they paid with their lives. They never caught the man I saw in the house. We never knew exactly what was in the briefcase he took with him. But every time it rains, I can't help but relive that night. The smell of blood mixed with the smell of the storm, and the echo of those footsteps that still haunt me in my dreams. There are crimes that change you forever, and this was one of them. Rain can erase footprints on the ground, but it cannot erase fear. And in my case, that fear is a constant reminder of what it means to face the true face of evil. My name is Javier, and the story I am about to tell is not an easy one to narrate. Every word I write reminds me of the night my life changed forever, the night I realized that evil has many forms, and that sometimes it hides right in front of us. That night the rain was falling furiously. It was as if the sky had broken and wanted to drown the city under a relentless deluge. The wind howled, battering the windows of my little house in the suburbs. I was alone, as I had been most of the time since my divorce. The loneliness didn't bother me. In fact, I had grown accustomed to it. I had learned to enjoy my quiet routine, the quiet hours, the long nights in front of the television. I lived in a quiet, almost boring neighborhood. Modest houses, neighbors who greeted with a gesture but rarely exchanged words. Routine was our norm, and that gave us a sense of security. But that night, everything changed. I was sitting, watching a documentary, while the sound of rain filled the background. I had turned off the main lights, leaving only a lamp in the corner which cast a warm, dim light. I had a cup of coffee in my hands when I heard something that didn't fit with the noise of the storm. It was a knock coming from the backyard. I set the cup down on the table and stood up, my heart beating a little faster than normal. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain. The darkness was almost total, interrupted only by sporadic flashes of lightning. I didn't see anything, but instinct told me something wasn't right. I went back, trying to convince myself that it was the wind, that maybe some branch had fallen. But just as I sat down, I heard another noise. This time it was different. It was a creak, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. My back door. Fear paralyzed me for a moment. Then I reacted, walking slowly toward the kitchen, where the back door was. I found it slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. I made sure the lock was in place before pushing it open and slamming it shut. That's when I saw it. Through the fogged glass of the window, a flash of movement in the courtyard. My breathing quickened as I tried to make out something in the darkness. No one was there, or so I wanted to believe. I closed all the curtains and turned off the lights, hoping that the darkness inside the house would protect me. I returned to the couch, but I could no longer relax. I was too alert, every sound amplified by my nervousness. That's when I heard a new noise, this time inside the house. It seemed to come from the basement, a place he rarely went down to. The basement was old, damp, and cold, and I used it mainly for storing things I didn't need. But now, that harmless space seemed threatening. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, my only makeshift weapon, and headed for the basement door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. I descended the steps slowly, each creak of wood echoing like a scream in the silence. When I reached the bottom, I turned on the light. The bulb flickered before stabilizing, illuminating the space with a dim light. I looked around. The boxes were in place. The old couch was still gathering dust in the corner, and everything looked normal. But then I saw it. On the far wall, right next to an old bookshelf, there was something I didn't remember seeing before. a hole in the floor, as if someone had ripped out a section of the boards. I approached cautiously, and the smell of damp earth grew more intense. The hole was small, but small enough for someone to get in or out of. I knelt down, trying to see what was underneath, but there was only darkness. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't mine. They were coming from upstairs. Panic overcame me. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, closing the basement door behind me. In the living room, the curtains of a window were slightly open, and I could see a silhouette moving outside the house. It was a man. His back was turned, holding something in his hands. I ducked behind the couch, trying not to make a sound. I heard the rustle of wet leaves as the man walked away, but my relief was brief. A loud knock echoed from the front door. Another knock, and then another. I hid in the bedroom closet, closing the door carefully. From my hiding place, I heard the front door open. Steady footsteps, the sound of something heavy shuffling, and then silence. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they would hear it. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe it was minutes, maybe hours. The rain kept falling and footsteps moved through the house. Finally, I heard the front door close again. I cautiously stepped out of the closet, holding the knife so tightly that my knuckles were white. The room was empty, but something was different. On the table, there was an object that wasn't there before. A wristwatch. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to my neighbor, Marcos. The rest of the night was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing strange. The hole in the basement had been covered, and Marcos's watch was gone. They looked at me as if I was crazy, as if I had imagined everything. The next day, I learned that Marcos was missing. His wife reported him missing that morning, saying he had not returned home after going for a run the night before. He was never found. Since then, I have never again felt safe in my own home. Every time it rains, every time I hear a noise in the night, I relive that night. And each time I wonder, who was that man? What did he want? And most frightening of all, will he ever come back? My name is Luis, and there are memories that should never be kept. However, some stay with you, embedded like splinters in your mind, refusing to go away. What happened that rainy night at the school where I worked is one of those memories, a fragment that will haunt me as long as I live. I had taken the position of janitor at the high school just 6 months earlier. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it gave me enough to support myself, and the quiet nights were a sort of refuge. My routine consisted of cleaning the classrooms after the students left, making sure the lights were off, and locking everything up before I went home. That night, the rain was pounding hard on the windows of the building. Droplets slid down the glass, distorting the lights on the outside poles, and the wind howled like a whale. I liked the sound of the storm. I found it soothing in its own chaotic way, but that tranquility was short-lived. The school was deserted. The hallways, normally teeming with life, were dark and silent except for the echo of my footsteps and the crunch of the mop against the floor. It was almost midnight when I finished with the classrooms on the second floor and made my way to the second. That's when I heard a noise that wasn't supposed to be there, the sound of a door slamming against its frame. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, mop water dripping in the silence. I turned my head toward the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the lab wing, an area that was not used after school hours. I thought maybe some window had been left open and the wind had pushed it out. I put down the mop and walked toward the labs, my flashlight illuminating the worn tiles on the floor. When I arrived, I found the door to one of the labs ajar. I pushed it cautiously, and the creak of the hinges echoed in the darkness. Everything seemed to be in order. The benches were lined up, the equipment intact. But the air in there was different, heavier, as if something invisible was filling the space. I closed the door, making sure the latch clicked, and prepared to go back into the hallway. But then I heard another noise. This time, it was coming from the third floor. The third floor of the school was different. It was barely used, and some classrooms had been locked for years. I climbed the stairs with an uneasy feeling growing in my chest. The lights in the hallway were flickering, and the sound of the rain was louder up there, as if the entire building was echoing with the weight of the storm. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw that one of the doors was open, the door to classroom 307, which I myself had closed that afternoon. I approached, feeling each step getting heavier, and pointed the flashlight inside. The classroom was empty, but there was something strange in the atmosphere. On one of the desks, there was an object that shouldn't be there. A knife. It was large, broad-bladed, and gleaming in the dim light of my flashlight. I stepped back, my mind trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe some student had left it there as a joke. Maybe they had used it in an activity and forgotten about it. But who forgets a knife like that? I decided not to touch it. I closed the door tighter this time and made sure the lock was in place. As I walked down the stairs, a shiver ran down my back as if someone was watching me. Back on the second floor, I started to turn off the lights and gather my things to leave. But just as I was about to leave, a sound stopped me in my tracks. Footsteps. Clear, steady, echoing from the second floor. Fear froze me for an instant. I grabbed a broomstick, my only makeshift weapon, and headed for the stairs. I climbed cautiously, every creak of the floor amplifying the tension. When I reached the second floor, I saw no one. I walked down the hallway, checking the classrooms one by one. Everything was in its place, but the air was still charged with that oppressive feeling as if something was lurking, waiting. At the end of the hallway, just as I turned to go down again, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A figure. I was at the back, by the window. A man dressed in dark clothes standing there as if he was waiting for me. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just looked at me. Instinct told me to run, but my legs did not respond. I could barely take a few steps back before the figure started walking toward me. He was holding something in his hand, something that glowed in the flickering light of the hallway. I turned and ran for the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I ran down as fast as I could, almost stumbling, and headed for the main exit. But when I got there, I found the door locked. My key was not in my pocket. The sound of footsteps descending the stairs made me turn my head. There he was, calmly walking down, as if he was in no hurry. At that moment, I knew he hadn't come by accident. He was hunting me. I ran to the opposite wing of the building, looking for a way out, but all the doors were locked. The only option was the gym, a large, empty space that was rarely used. I entered and closed the door behind me, blocking it with a bench. The gymnasium was dark, lit only by the lightning that filtered through the tall windows. I hid behind one of the curtains covering the baskets, trying to control my breathing. Footsteps approached, slow but steady. The gym door shook, and then I heard the sound of wood breaking. I had entered. The man walked through the gym, his silhouette silhouetted against the lightning. He carried the knife in his hand and swung it as if enjoying the moment. He passed close to my hiding place, and I could feel his presence, his breath. When he came out, I waited a few minutes before moving. I left the gym and ran to the main office where there was a landline phone. I called the police, explaining what little I could between gasps. When they arrived, the man was already gone. They searched the building but found no trace of him. The knife in room 307 was gone, and the officers looked at me with a mixture of skepticism and concern. Days later, I learned that a man had been arrested in a nearby neighborhood. He was carrying a knife similar to the one I saw that night and was linked to a series of crimes in the area. I never knew what he was doing at the school or why he targeted me. All I know is that every time I hear the rain pounding against the windows, I remember that night. And I wonder how much closer it came to catching me than I care to admit. Valentine's Day has always been a strange date for me. Maybe because I never fully connected with the romantic meaning of flowers, chocolates, and candlelight dinners. But that rainy night forever changed what that day meant in my life. Now every February 14th, I can't help but think about what happened, how I became a witness to something that should have remained hidden. It all started with a downpour that transformed the city into a maze of puddles and shadows. I had spent the afternoon in the bar where I used to work, a simple place that was barely filled in the middle of the week. That night, however, it was livelier than usual. Couples occupied the tables, some shy and some drunk with love. The decorations of red hearts and hanging lights seemed ridiculous to me, but they served to attract customers, and that was enough. At 10 o'clock, my shift was over. I went out to the back alley to avoid the bustle of the main entrance. The rain was coming down with such intensity that my jacket was of little use. As I walked to my car, I heard a thud like a thud coming from an abandoned building at the end of the street. I thought nothing of it. Strange sounds were common in that part of town, where vagrants and teenagers sought shelter in search of a dry place. However, as I started the car's engine, I noticed something that made me stop. A figure was moving hurriedly toward the same building. It was a tall man, wearing a dark coat and a hat covering his face. He was carrying something in his hands, something that looked like a box or a wrapped package. I would have continued on my way had it not been for the fact that, as he opened the door of the building, he revealed the edge of a knife protruding from his waist. My curiosity got the better of me. I left the car parked and walked in the rain to the building. The place was in ruins, broken windows, graffiti on the walls, and a pungent, musty smell. There was no light, except for the lightning that briefly illuminated the corridors. I carefully climbed up a rusty metal ladder, trying not to make a sound. I felt something was wrong, terribly wrong, but I couldn't turn back. As I reached the second floor, I heard voices. Two people were arguing in low voices, and although I could not understand what they were saying, there was a tension evident in their tones. I approached a half-open door from which I could see the faint glow of a flashlight. I froze as I saw what was going on inside. There was a woman sitting in a chair, bound hand and foot with duct tape. Her eyes were covered with a handkerchief, but her body was visibly trembling. In front of her, the man in the dark coat held a knife in one hand and a note in the other. Next to him, a makeshift table with wilted flowers and a bottle of cheap wine. The whole scene looked like a grotesque mockery of Valentine's Day. The man was mumbling something, but his words were lost in the noise of the rain and my racing heartbeat. Everything in me was screaming that I should run, but my feet were not responding. My mind was caught between the horror of what I was seeing and the need to do something. Suddenly, another man entered the room. This one was shorter and stockier, wearing a leather jacket that was dripping with water. He was carrying a bag that he dropped on the floor with a thud. From my hiding place, I could see that inside was more duct tape, ropes, and a bloody piece of cloth. The woman let out a groan and my stomach churned. This was no simple robbery or impromptu kidnapping. What was happening was methodical, calculated. The man in the dark coat pointed to the bag and then to the woman, as if giving instructions. The other nodded and approached the victim. It was then that I noticed something on her hand. A ring, identical to the one my ex-girlfriend had worn years before. It was an unusual model, with a leaf design around the central stone. I remembered that we had bought it together at a local store. The detail distracted me so much that I didn't notice when both men turned toward the door. My eyes met those of the burly man. For a second, the world seemed to stop. Then the man shouted something, and the man in the dark coat ran for the door. My instincts finally kicked in, and I turned to escape. I ran down the hallway, slipping on the wet floor as the footsteps of my pursuers echoed behind me. I ran down the metal stairs, feeling sweaty hands clinging to the railing. My heart was pounding so hard I feared it would burst. As I reached the alley, the rain hit my face with such force that I could barely see. I reached into my pocket for my car keys, but they were gone. In desperation, I remembered that I had left them in the ignition. I ran to the vehicle, and just as I was closing the door, a hand tapped on the window. It was the man in the dark coat, knife held high. I turned the key, and the engine roared just as he tried to open the door. I stepped on the gas and pulled out of the alley, but I didn't go very far. I parked at a gas station a few blocks away, my body shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I called the police from my cell phone, giving the address of the building and describing what I had seen. I stayed in the car, waiting for them to arrive. 20 minutes later, patrol cars and sirens lit up the street. I watched from a distance as officers entered the building with flashlights and guns drawn. The next day, the news reported that a woman's body had been found in the building. It was 26-year-old Maria, who had disappeared days earlier after leaving her job at a nearby store. The men responsible were not caught that night, but it was later discovered that they were linked to a network of murders and kidnappings. Although the case was resolved, the guilt haunts me to this day. I could have done more. I could have intervened sooner. But when I remember that night, the sound of the rain and the look of the man in the dark coat, I know I was lucky to get out alive. Valentine's Day is no longer a date of love for me. It's a reminder of how fragile life can be and how close I came to losing mine. I was at a point in my life where things didn't seem to make sense. I lost the job I loved, my relationships fell apart, and the pain of a series of bad decisions was drowning me in an ocean of hopelessness. That's when I met Victor, a deep-eyed, soft-spoken man who seemed to understand my inner demons. He didn't judge me. He didn't condemn me. He spoke as if all my struggles were just steps on the road to something bigger, something better. One afternoon, while I was working in the repair shop, Victor approached me with an invitation. It was to go to a supposedly special meeting at a place that was far from the city. He promised that there we would find peace, redemption, and a way to heal the deepest wounds. Something inside me was awakened, a spark of hope, and I decided to attend. The rain began to fall just as I left the city. The road was getting darker as I went along, and I couldn't help but feel that the storm was not just meteorological, but something more sinister. Victor had said the place was isolated, but upon arrival the estate looked like something out of another time. In the center of a small forest, an old stone mansion stood before us. The door was open, inviting us to enter. The first impression was warm. Inside, there was a different atmosphere. The members of the group greeted each other with hugs and smiles. Everyone seemed to know their places in the world. The place was adorned with candles that dimly lit the large room, and there was a calm that belied the storm raging outside. The leader of the group, Ava, greeted us with a friendly smile. Her gaze was penetrating, and her voice, soft, had a kind of calming power. There was something about her that made me feel as if I had finally found a home. Ava spoke of connection, of transcendence. She explained that the group was there to achieve true awakening, freeing us from the chains of ego and suffering. It seemed like the perfect place for someone like me. At first, the meetings were simple: meditations, self-knowledge exercises, group chanting. Everything seemed so pure, so full of good intentions. The rain kept pounding on the roof of the mansion, creating a steady rhythm that helped deepen my concentration. The days passed, and I felt more and more part of the community. However, something strange began to happen. The mostly quiet and friendly members began to change. There was a tension in the air, something I couldn't quite identify but couldn't ignore. Ava and the other leaders were talking more about sacrifices, about leaving behind everything that tied us to the outside world, which was beginning to be perceived as corrupt and full of distractions. Whenever someone expressed doubts, they were removed from the group and taken to one of the upper rooms to be purified. One night, after a long day of ceremonies and chanting, Ava summoned us all to the great hall. The storm outside was stronger than ever, and the thunder rumbled like a harbinger of what was to come. Ava, with her usual calmness, informed us that we were ready for a final ritual, something that had to be performed to achieve total liberation. No one hesitated, no one objected. I, in my state of apathetic surrender, went with the flow. We were led into the basement of the mansion. There the stone walls felt damp and cold. The air was stuffy, and candlelight was the only light illuminating the space. The floor was covered by a red carpet, and in the center, a hooded figure was on his knees, bound and apparently in a trance-like state. Ava explained that this was a necessary sacrifice, the last step to reach eternal peace, to reach divinity. The hooded man did not scream. He did not resist. He just remained motionless, as if waiting for something to happen. Ava approached slowly, and with a deep look, she told us that in order to achieve complete liberation, we had to offer our will to the group. What happened next I cannot fully describe, but I watched as one of the members, someone with whom I had shared laughter and meditation, raised a ceremonial knife and plunged it into the flesh of the hooded man. It was the sound that paralyzed me. It was not a scream, but a deep whisper, a whisper of pain and despair that echoed inside me. Blood began to soak the red carpet, and at that moment I understood that I was not in a healing group, but in a cult that fed on the suffering of others. Fear gripped me, and in an instant of clarity I knew I had to run. But before I could move, someone grabbed my arm. It was Victor. His gaze was empty, his face a mask of indifference. He told me that everything that happened there was part of the process, that I had to be one with them to find peace. Something inside me screamed for release, but Eva's words echoed in my head, telling me of total liberation, of purification. I managed to break free from his grip. I ran through the corridors, my footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The mansion seemed like a maze, and every time I turned a corner, the sound of the storm grew louder, more oppressive. Finally, I reached the front door. The rain was still pouring down relentlessly, but I didn't care. I ran without looking back, not really knowing where I was going. I just wanted to get away from everything I had seen. I never saw the mansion or its inhabitants again. Although when I arrived in the city and reported everything I had experienced, the agents found no evidence. No one else had witnessed what happened that night. Only I was left with the memories, with the image of the blood on the floor, Victor's empty gaze, and Eva's words echoing in my mind. Today, as the rain comes down hard. I wonder if it was ever real or if it was all a dark dream. But every time I close my eyes, the storm still roars, and the image of that mansion, hidden among the trees, haunts me.